Hello and welcome back to Well That Ished Well. And this week we are for the fourth time joined by Lindsay Powell. We previously discussed Germanicus, we discussed Agrippa and the Julio-Claudian dynasty in a two-part series where we briefly discuss what we are discussing today, because this book has been a long time coming and we have teased this episode on the podcast before from what I remember. And I've been super excited about doing this one because we talked about this. I think it was 2 years back at least that we talked about this book
Wow.
coming. So it's been a long time. It's been a long time, but well overdue. We are going to discuss with Lindsay Powell this week Tiberius from and I have one with the book here, which of course Pen and Sword was so kind to send me a copy of. So thank you to Pen and Sword for sending me a copy of the recently that came out in June. It will be available in the US very soon. It's Tiberius from Masterful Commander to Masterful Emperor of Rome. And of course, Tiberius is the discussion of this week's episode. And it's, needless to say, I think it's quite a controversial emperor a bit because he's been kind of misunderstood. And I think the last time you were on when we discussed the Julio-Claudian dynasty, we talked about this as well. That he is a bit of a controversial character. So, and we're going to talk about this, of course. So, what do you think it is about Tiberius? What attracted you to make a biography of him? Because in English, at least, there hasn't been that many biographies of him, at least recently, and most scholars, even Tom. I don't get me wrong, I love Tom Holland, but it's even he kind of I feel misunderstand Tiberius a bit in his book, about the Julio-Claudian dynasty. I don't remember the book's name, but what do you think? Even some modern scholars get wrong about Tiberius from your experience writing about him, and what do you think? What attracted you to write about him?
There's a lot in what you just said, and thank you for that welcome. That's lovely. Tiberius was the obvious person I had to write about because he appeared in all the other books I had written. And when I discussed projects with my commissioning editor, Phil Sidnall, I'd started off with the so-called Drusus the Elder, who is Nero Claudius Drusus, who was the youngest brother of Tiberius. That then led me to Germanicus, and then as a sidestep, I did Marcus Agrippa, who has lots of parallels, interesting, with Tiberius. And then finally, Augustus at war. And then I did a big detour to Bar Kokhba 100 years later, which was about a Jewish rebellion. So to complete the series in my own head, I had to come back to Tiberius. I've been fascinated with him in large part because what I had read about him in his early life and then what was described of his later life were like two different people. And that didn't sit well with me. The other thing is that he plays a pivotal role in, for example, Christianity. I don't consider myself Christian. I'm a humanist, but the point is I recognize Christianity is important for a lot of people. And I was on my journey in writing about him was really a surprise what I learned that early Christian writers wrote about him. So that was something I wanted to bring to the public gaze. And he's the sort of person that fits between the super strongman of Augustus and the other guy who is this normally portrayed as the crazy Caligula. So he's squished in between, and between the shadows of the two individuals, people tend to forget him. And I just thought it was about time to tell the story properly. And I was surprised what it told me when I did the research.
So before we go in, was there anything that surprised you about him that you thought you knew, but that you didn't really know about the man before you began to write about him?
There's a couple of things. I would say partly was his traditional nature. There was a sort of stubborn Claudian pride in him. The other thing that goes, he had to put that aside in his lifetime in order to become the adopted son of Augustus, and in doing that became a Julian. And I wonder what that did to his spirit to something. He had to literally turn his back on his long, proud family tradition. And his emotional sense. You get the sense from reading the accounts that you've got someone of great emotional energy, which he has to constrain. And part of it is through his military exploits, and part of it through the politics, and the other thing through the other elements of his private life, which are way more complicated, I think, than people know. So I'd say it's those three things. They're things that really make him a dynamic person. One thing I learned about Tiberius is he was not flat and boring. A lot
Yeah.
of people will tend to think of him as that. I discovered a man who was not. And it was the wrestling between what he was expected to do in the years before he was an emperor and the years he was an emperor would test anybody's mettle. And I think people are not willing to be open-minded or sympathetic. What's surprising is, for example, is the ages at which he was expected to do things. He was very young when he went on his first military mission. He was only in his 50s when he took on the mantle of being an emperor. And when he ultimately retired, if that's what it is, to Capri, he's already in his late 60s. And most people in this world, in our days, would say, yeah, a man sort of retires between 65, 68, 70. And yet we're still expecting someone to go on ruling in a time when that would already be considered.
Look at some rulers of today's world, for example. They are way beyond the age of 60, to put it that way.
Well, I happen to be in a country where that is true. So, but I mean, life expectancies have changed anyway over the years. But in the case of this individual, it's amazing that he had been in harm's way for so many decades. And then he takes on this other sort of political, civil role. And that takes him out of harm's way, you could argue, but then puts him in a whole different world of stress. And then, of course, historians in the writings after him took him to be the counter to points they were trying to make. And of course, I think in the process of doing that, they made him a caricature. And I think what's happened, unfortunately for him, is that the caricature is how most people see him. And then if you look at modern TV and films and so on, they've built on that. Most recently on Netflix and other channels that we're all familiar with.
So let's begin with his family and his upbringing from his upbringing until he goes into the military. So let's begin with his early years and talk about how he ended up becoming a military commander, and his family tree, of course.
To go back to the origin story, he comes from the Claudian family, as we say in English, and it's a very old, established aristocratic family. Interesting enough, on his father's side and on his mother, they are both Claudians. They're slightly different branches of the Claudian clan, but they're Claudians. So he is born into a very well-known branch, a clan in a sort of Scottish sense, with famous people all the way through its steps and decades. And even his father, who is also called Tiberius Claudius Nero, has himself done quite well out of the Roman system. So to put everything in context, our man Tiberius Claudius Nero is born in 42 BC. And what's really interesting is that everybody knows the Ides of March 44 BC, so you can see that it's already a traumatic time in Roman history. And in 42 BC, the man who's inherited Julius Caesar's name and reputation and legacy is what we now call Octavian. And he is already on the battlefield with Marcus Antonius at Philippi, for example, in October of that year. So between the time that ends, which is October, and November when Tiberius is born, is just a month. And civil war has been raging in those 2 years before that point. And his parents have been on the run nearly all the time. So he is a young kid in growing up in a post-war scenario, but his family is not strange to war. So if you go back to his father, I said his name is the same as our man Tiberius Claudius Nero. He did very well under Julius Caesar. He became an admiral and was highly regarded and rewarded by Julius Caesar. And the big surprise is that on the assassination of Julius Caesar, he had a particular role within the Roman state, and in fact, he decided that in overseeing the prosecutions of the conspirators, that they could kind of get away with it. So, in fact, instead of being a person that stood up for vengeance against the assassination of Julius Caesar, for the fair running of the Roman Republic, he kind of goes along with the story that the Cassius and Brutuses of the conspiracy do, and they go off and become governors of different provinces. And it's only because the heir, Octavian, decides that's not good enough, that then there needs to be an accounting for the assassination, that the civil war erupts, and then you find Tiberius Claudius Nero, the father, on the run. And in fact, he tries to go to one side and doesn't get support, looks to Sextus Pompeius, who's the younger son of the famous Pompey the Great, who was at one point the stepson of Julius Caesar, but also then became the rival because he was the person to whom the conspirators all rallied around, hoping that they could get some support there. But the point is that Sextus Pompeius is leading a if you like a revolutionary action against the man who's beginning to grow in prominence in all this time, which is Octavian, and is ultimately defeated. And
if I may, was it inevitable that Octavian would be the victor at this point, or was it like, did you see where it would end, or was it like uncertain how the outcome would be?
I actually don't think it was inevitable. I think the one thing you realize when you study the intricacies of history is it's always a near-run thing. It could easily have been the other way. And in the case of Octavian, you have to remember that in the sort of the 40s and then going into the 30s, but in the 40s, he's 21, 22. So he has actually come from nowhere, essentially. The only reason he's got where he is because he's now got the name of Julius Caesar and had been favored by him. And the whole point was that he was being trained up by Julius Caesar.
Because Caesar slept with his mother, essentially.
Well, that's an allegation. I can't prove that. Yeah. But my point is this, is that in the years where the power is beginning to be split between strong men, it is remarkable that a 20-something becomes a strong man. And I think that's partly because he's able to raise an army. In defeating the conspirators at Philippi in 42 with the help of Marcus Antonius, he gets authoritas. He gets prestige, being able to do that, and he was able to really lean into the whole idea of becoming a dux, which is to say a military leader, with effectively a private army at his disposal. And they were doing it because they loved the memory of Julius Caesar specifically, and this man was his heir, and they followed him as opposed to the other people, and they naturally wanted to avenge the death or the murder of their leader. So by the time you get to the time of Tiberius, the world has already been in turmoil. And what you're left with is effectively Octavian, who is on the western side of the empire, and his colleagues, there are two other colleagues in this triumvirate, as it's called, are dividing up the Roman world in such a way so that their intention is to restore the operation of the Roman Republic, the res publica, which is the Roman Commonwealth, which they believe has been twisted and corrupted and so on, and their mission, self-appointed mission, is to try and restore it to a fully working institution or set of institutions. And of course, historians discuss even now whether that was really just propaganda or whether that was true or not. But it is into this world that our man Tiberius Claudius Nero is born. And his parents, who have been on the run, are able, through the amnesty of the, I think it's the Treaty of Brindisi, they're able to go back. Was it Mycenium? They're able to go back to Rome, and now he can actually grow up as a little tiny kid. There's a little cute little story in, I think it's Suetonius, where when the parents were trying to get protection from Sextus Pompeius, the little baby causes quite a consternation because they think, oh, isn't he cute? And in fact, the wife of Sextus Pompeius gives him a little jewel, which even during his life and after is still displayed at Baiae, like in a little kind of museum or a shrine. So it's just interesting, isn't it, that just in the same way today we think about our famous people and, oh, that was their birthplace and this was his first lock of hair and look, there were his milk teeth. They were doing those things in those days too. So there's a story of a young Tiberius who sometimes gets lost in all of this narrative, because then what people normally know is, oh, that's right, he went off to Parthia, and it's like he didn't have a life. He was 20 by the time he did that. But in his youth, he did exactly what every other aspiring aristocrat in the Roman system did. This thing called the cursus honorum, the race of honor, in which there were grades of magistracy. It started with a quaestor and then worked up. And depending on whether you were actually picked or elected to that position, you would actually gain experience of the Roman Commonwealth and its operations. You might travel around the empire in different guises. So Tiberius's first assignment in that regard, in fact, is to be based in Italy. He's looking after the issues of crime and justice, as it were, in Italy. One is to look after issues of, apparently there were people who would be quite happily traveling through Italy to find themselves basically assaulted and kidnapped and then forced to work in slave factories. And this had become endemic. And in fact, he was part of a group of people that were trying to investigate this, and where there were grave abuses and citizens were being captured, they were freed and so on prosecutions report. And of course, he also looked after the corn supply, which was a classic high responsibility. His first major military operation really is in Spain, where he is involved as a
Is that
junior.
where he joined Marcus Agrippa at this point, or is that earlier?
So Agrippa is very much at the height of his powers, and he's with Augustus at this. By 2070, he's called Augustus, but for the time being, we'll call him Octavian. They sort of flip flop between one being in Rome, the other one's traveling, the other one comes to Rome, the other one goes traveling, and it's a very clever double act, and I think it's very stabilizing in that way because Octavian has someone who can represent him in Rome while he's away. And in fact, one of the things that Octavian decides at this point is that really there's unfinished business in Spain. And in the 20s, we're talking about 26, 25 BC, he decides that there's a job of work to be done over in Spain. The preface to say to this is that in 27, we need to sort of fill in the little bit of detail here, which is there was a growing conflict between the two triumvirs, Marcus Antonius and Octavian in this case, and it really is an insoluble and sort of toxic chemistry, and they're both strong men. Octavian has actually developed much more prestige and following in the West. The third man in this triumvirate, whose name is Aemilius Lepidus, is effectively sidelined and becomes a Pontifex Maximus, so that it leaves just basically a duovir as opposed to a triumvir, to be technical about these things. But at this point, then, the chemistry really is what to do, and all of it comes to a head at Actium, which of course is the big pivotal battle in 31.
And we discussed this before, of course, on this podcast as well. So you're trying to check out some of the other episodes we did as well, because there are some great episodes we did.
Thank you. So the point about Marcus Agrippa, he really is the force behind, in a sense, backing up Octavian militarily and in other areas actually of Roman civilization, architecture, planning, the military, and so forth. And at Actium, he brings his brilliance as an admiral to bear and defeats the navy of Antonius and Cleopatra. And ultimately, in Alexandria, they fall, one through suicide. The one may have been assassinated. We're not quite sure whether there really was an asp involved in the death of Cleopatra. I think a little like Adrian Goldsby that there could be a case made for an assassination. There are reasons why that might have actually been a very good way out for Octavian. So by the time he's resolved those wars, we're at 30 BC. So young Tiberius is still kind of only in his, like a 10-year-old or something of that order, 12-year-olds actually, and he's growing up in Rome the whole time. And so you can imagine that he, like most of the people in Rome, would have been getting news bulletins coming in. Oh, the latest news from Actium, the latest news from Alexandria. And it would have been thrilling on the one hand and very disturbing in another. And just to sort of explain something along the family lines at this point, in 38, Tiberius has a brother who's Nero Claudius Drusus, who is the younger boy, And in the days after that delivery of the baby boy, Octavian marries Livia, who is in fact Tiberius's mother. So the binding together is these two families. And what's significant is that Octavian does not adopt either of the two sons. The sons are by this Tiberius Claudius Nero, and what Octavian insists that Tiberius Claudius Nero, the father, does is to divorce Livia so that he can marry her. The two sons then go to live with the father. So they're raised in the traditional Claudian household with all of the stories of consuls and dictators and all the things that are famous in their family. And it's only when Tiberius Claudius Nero dies several years later, but not many years, but 8 years later, I think it was, that they then go into the household of Livia to be raised by the mother and by their stepfather, in this case, who's Octavian. So you can see that
we should also mention, I think, that there isn't that much age difference between Augustus and Tiberius, from what I remember. It isn't that huge. He isn't that much
it's
younger.
2 decades. It's 2 decades. So Augustus, as we now call him, after 27 BC, was born in 63. Tiberius in 42. So there's a generation roughly in their differences. But what's very interesting is their family upbringings and their family traditions. So our Tiberius, as I said at the start of the show, is a member of the Claudian family, and as is his mother. But there's the Claudi Nerones and the Claudi Drusi, who are the other branch of that, and they are very, very proud. So you can imagine he's been taught this through family members, and the role that they have played historically as being defenders of the Roman Republic, the Commonwealth, people who are full participants in the political system, people who go out and do amazing things on the battlefield and achieve great victories and so on. And there's no reason why Tiberius himself will not be any of those things in turn.
And indeed he will be, as we shall see.
Well, that's true. In contrast, Octavian, from what I recall, is really an equestrian. So he's not from a high-up family with a long tradition. I mean, the Octavii, so he comes from the Octavian clan, are kind of middling. I mean, they're not terribly famous. The full name is Turinus, which means that there was maybe a association of victory. One of the family members, the father perhaps, in Turinus, Turii. And other than that, it's only because he comes to the attention of Julius Caesar that he sort of comes into the story at all. But Julius Caesar saw something in this man. And he is a fascinating individual. And he's actually sometimes very hard to pin down, because he went on to become emperor. He was the longest running emperor. He died at the age of 75 and ruled for something like 44 years. And in that time shaped his story. And the rest of history is pretty much bowed down to the shaping of the story that he crafted, which I have to say is not what happened with Tiberius, interesting enough. And that's where some of the interesting differences come in. And what Augustus effectively did after 27 was to retool the Roman Commonwealth to become an imperial system. So it had a lot of the machinery of the Republic, with its people voting and the Senate voting and issuing decrees and people voting on laws and lots of magistrates and so on and so forth. And so, on the outside, it worked.
But ultimately, Augustus had the final say in, and he could veto pretty much anything. From what I understand, he could veto anything he wanted and say no or yes to whichever policy he liked. From my understanding.
That's largely true. I think the interesting context is here is under Julius Caesar, the Senate had something like 600 men. After the Civil War, numbers of those people who had fled then with Cicero and Crassus and the other people had died in the various battles or been hunted down and killed. There was a shrinking down of the Senate. I think it was to 300 anyway under Augustus. So a lot of the people in that institution really were people who were supporters of him. They'd done all right. They were people who got to gain from being a loyal supporter. And you've got to remember that Roman society was a patron-client structure. So a patron was typically a richer individual under whom the clients, so patronus and clientes, would assemble, and these people would give him prestige visually because they were just large numbers of them. They would go every day to his house, so they would greet him, and then they would, as a kind of a trade, I'm seeking your vote on this and this and this. I need your vote, and these people will turn out and actually put their vote in the ballot when the time comes in the various committee structures. And what Augustus is able to do is to use all of that sort of political theatre and the way it works, and to keep it going, but at the same time to be more directive as how could we call them emperors, right? The Romans didn't call them emperors. It's interesting. So the title that Augustus chose, or was chosen for him, was princeps, which really means.
Because from my again, sorry for interrupting you, but the imperator was more a military title rather than what we think of as emperor. Imperator was more a military title, and as we shall see, Augustus and Tiberius were both honored by the title imperator, and so it was more of a military triumph title rather than what we think of as emperor today.
Yes, it simply means in Latin commander.
Yeah.
Imperator, and where it was traditionally used, you have to remember that the Roman army, after the establishment of the Roman Republic around about 509 BC, all the way through to effectively the assassination of Julius Caesar, was a militia. It was a citizen army, and whenever it was called out to go to war, people would turn out and they would be picked by lot. There's a sort of element of chance and randomness in it, so that people didn't keep being picked all the time. And the idea was they'd go away for the campaign, which would be a season, so the summer season, for example, and then they'd come back and they'd go back to the farms and so on and so forth. And if the general brought them victory, they'd all punch the sky and say, Imperator. And this became a title, an acclamation, as the technical expression is, and they would use it after their names. So, for example, it could be Caius Marius Imperator, Marcus Antonius Imperator. What was crafty by the man we called Octavian and then later Augustus is that he decided to call himself by the first name Imperator. So it was an interesting psychological trick. So he'd actually won the title, but he decided to make that his name. So he became. Remember, he had actually inherited the name of Julius Caesar. So by the time we get to the time that Tiberius is born in 42, he is not being called Octavian anymore. He is being called Imperator Kaiser, Emperor Caesar in our way, but actually just simply means Commander Caesar. And it's just very interesting as an insight into Roman psychology is that family relationships can be changed, and so can names. So you can literally move from one family to another and take on board their entire history as you move from one to the other, in a way that really we don't. When you adopt, sort of, you're aware that you have another history behind you and so. But the Romans seem to have the psyche where you come in a bit like a Lego brick and you snap on, and now you're one of us. And when Octavian was adopted by Julius Caesar, he switched into the Julii, so he became a part of the Julian. But Tiberius was a Claudian, right? He was not a Julian. And in fact, when his mother marries Augustus, he doesn't become a Julian. That's really interesting. So all the way through his early years, he's very conscious of the fact of being a very old, proud, strong, successful Roman family, which has long roots, goes all the way back probably to the kings in the 8th century, in a way that actually someone like Augustus doesn't. So you have to imagine that although you were saying that there was not much difference in age, I think there was a much difference in the perception of their relative importance in Roman society. But what Octavian Augustus was actually doing was building his prestige and building his reputation pretty much all on his own, which is one of the most compelling things about him as an individual. So when he takes on the name Imperator Kaiser, and that's what you see on coins, Imp Kais, he is making a very strong statement, and it's calling on the military achievement. It's calling on the legacy of Julius Caesar. Octavian is nowhere to be seen in that. It's an invented persona. And to come into a household like that must have been quite interesting to a teenager. So he must have been very aware, because of course his mother's married to him, that they really are in a very important family. Things revolve around them, and by the time you get to the
He's the
Battle of
main
Actium,
character, as we say today.
yes, absolutely. So by the time you get to Actium and Alexandria, with the elimination of Marcus Antonius, they would have been aware of his supremacy, his preeminence over other families. And what's fascinating is the way that Augustus does this trick, where with the Senate, he basically says, "I'm going to give it all back to you. You know, my mission is complete now." And they go, "No, no, no, no! Please don't do that. We don't want another civil war." And they divide the empire into these military territories along the perimeter, and then these consular provinces, the people's provinces, actually in the center, which is where the Senate basically has its sway. And what that gives Augustus is this amazing power, given partly by the fact of the Senate gave him the actual legal power, but he has an army to back it up. The Senate really has about 2 or 3 legions out of the 30 at the time. To put that in context, at the end of the Battle of Actium, that there were 19 legions on Marcus Antonius' side, which surrendered to Octavian at the time, and Marcus Agrippa is actually given the task of having to demob them. And over the next several years, the two of those individuals, Agrippa and Augustus, they basically collapsed the army into a much smaller organization, about 30 legions, maybe something like 300,000 men in total. And the point about this is that he professionalizes the army, and by doing that, he's actually broken with the long centuries old tradition of the army as being basically a citizen militia. It becomes a profession, and people will serve for 16 years, and they'll be paid for that time, and they'll be given armor and training, and they'll be given a sort of career structure. And into that, then Tiberius fits. So his first military assignment is as a military tribune, and he's a senior military tribune at that. Like I said, there are 6. You have a tribune with the broad stripe, and another 5 with the narrow stripe. And the one with the broad stripe is the aristocrat amongst the team, and he is the one who's in charge. And that's where he learns to follow the arts of war and command, and he learns from the conciliatory council, the advisory body that a legate typically has in a legion, with other tribunes and prefects, and for example, centurions. So it's very much learning on the job. And then having completed that, he's then given this other mission, which is to go over to Parthia, where he actually negotiates a peace treaty, all the way to what is happening when he's 20. And so it's the amazing
Because
speed.
we should mention, I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but we should mention that Parthia was the greatest rival for the Roman Empire, and the Armenia, in what we I wouldn't say roughly around what we think of Armenia today, but that was a key part, from my understanding from reading your book, was a key part of the peace with Parthia as well.
That's true. And so when you think about it, when in the way the sequence of times go, so Augustus comes in, he establishes this unique arrangement with the Senate. He divides it slightly with Agrippa, so that he can then travel the provinces. And he decides to go to Spain. Tiberius goes with him. They think they finished the war. Now they can focus their attention on the other side of the world, which is their big arch nemesis, Parthia, and has been for centuries. Marcus Antonius, for example, had tried to take on Parthia in
And
a
we have the
war of
famous
conquest.
Crassus. We have the famous Crassus story as well, where he is allegedly, and again, just another sign up for Game of Thrones, I believe. It was inspired by the story where Crassus get a golden liquid poured down his throat, which is the end of Viserys in Game of Thrones as well, I believe. So you have the famous story where Crassus defeat at Parthian's hands as well.
It's a wonderfully deviously awful story, and I somehow don't think it's true. There's actually a gold
Hmm.
statue. Somebody actually made one of those. He actually made this sort of this head and this
Hmm.
intestinal tract, all of gold. And the idea was that yes, Christ had been forced to swallow molten gold. So there's a really he's a really interesting character all on his own. He was the richest man. He was an entrepreneur. He was a impresario, a property developer, made massive masses of money. Fancied that he was a guy worthy of politics, and went off on this megalomaniac tour. And
I'm sorry about the little trap. We just had to take a little break. But yeah, we were talking about Crassus' famous defeat and how Parthia, as we will see, will be related to Tiberius in a second. But yeah, we're talking about how even Crassus and how the Romans have failed. And I believe as well Adrian Goldsworthy has written a book about the Parthia and the Roman relationship as well. But that's another discussion for later. But there was an intense rivalry between them because they were the main superpower against Rome at this time.
yes, they were remarkably evenly balanced powers, not only in terms of landmass and numbers of people, but their military and political sophistication. And I think one of the things that the Romans up to Augustus really could not seem to reconcile with the reality on the ground. So Julius Caesar had planned to go ultimately fight wars with Parthia. That was the reason why his adopted son, ultimately Octavian, was actually in Illyricum to be trained, so he could actually be military savvy enough that he could actually be a participant in the war. But of course, Ides of March, Julius Caesar's dead. And then in the subsequent years, then Marcus Antonius, with money from Cleopatra, tries to run these various campaigns in Armenia and Parthia with disastrous results. And at least Cleopatra was smart enough to give him money, not an army. So she lost the money, but she kept her army. And of course, that was basically lost at Alexandria 30 instead. But what Octavian, and we'll call him Augustus from now on, so after 27, was smart enough to realize that the military solution was not working, and it would not work for a whole complex number of different reasons. Much better would be to try and negotiate a peace treaty or a non-aggression pact, something of that order.
And
And
and,
what
and,
he
and again, so Armenia is the key here because they wanted to have to show from your book, from what I understand, they wanted to have a pro-Roman king in Armenia to kind of balance the power against Parthia at this point, right?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that when you look at the geography of the region, we're talking about the border of the Roman Empire from what they call Syria and the Euphrates, right? And everything on the east side of the Euphrates effectively was Parthian territory.
Hmm.
And then sort of straddling like a sort of cap on the top is Armenia. And so Armenia was always in play. So the way that the Parthian Empire was set up, it had satraps. It was a vast land area. So whereas the Romans had, for example, governors and imperial legates who were managing provinces, what effectively you had was sort of smaller kingdoms, which were satrapies, and the King of Kings actually had those people swear fealty and homage to him. And Armenia was another one of those, but in fact was, because of it, I suppose it was further away, remoteness, and its geography, it was able to side with one side or the other. And there was this sort of proxy war, a diplomatic game going on between Rome and Parthia to try and persuade whoever was in power to consider their interests. So it's a very interesting land in sort of ancient diplomacy as to why exactly it should play that pivotal role. But it will come to play a role in Tiberius's life even. So at this stage, Tiberius is sent on a military expedition, and he goes to Syria, and he's still only in his 20s at this. This is the remarkable thing about this, and in taking with him a sort of like I guess a delegation of senior Romans, they go about negotiating this peace treaty that Augustus is keen for. Now, one of the things when I was researching my book on Marcus Agrippa, I discovered a paper which had been written during the First World War, which made a lot of sense to me. is that what Marcus Agrippa had done when he was out in Lesbos, Mytilene, had actually been part of the negotiation that led up to the final signing of the document. So I suspect what happened was that that's more likely than not to have happened. So Tiberius doesn't go and negotiate from scratch. He's probably able to build on the negotiations already having taken place with Marcus Agrippa. And he comes in as a direct member of the imperial family, the son of the emperor's wife, and so on, to be able to do this deal. And on the banks of the Euphrates, they do the prisoner swap, so they actually take the remaining survivors from Carrhae and also from the Antonian Wars out there, and the important battle standards, the Signa and the Eagles, the Aquili, and then they bring them back. And in fact, it's in terms of Augustan propaganda, an important moment, because what he's able to say, I achieved what other people could not without spilling of blood. I had the far-sightedness to be able to build a permanent treaty with those people, so we will not repeat the horrors of war. And in fact, as a prize, I've also taken back these totemic eagles and also brought back free Roman citizens. And then they take them back to Rome, and of course, in the process of doing that, they meet with Virgil. Virgil dies. That's a whole other story. But Tiberius is pivotal in that negotiation. And for someone of that youth, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, you think about it. All he's done up to that point was he's been born into war. He then goes through a fairly traditional education. He then does a fairly junior job, as you're expected to do in the Roman government system. He then goes off to train as a soldier, as a middle-ranking soldier in the Spanish War, the Cantabrian War, and then he's given this massive mission, which he pulls off. It's quite remarkable.
Now, I think the next subject we should discuss is one of the rather I think more people are familiar with, and that is Tiberius' love life, of course, because because I want to discuss his marriage to his first wife, because that seemed to be actually a rather well matched when he married his first wife, Hispania. So let's talk about his first marriage, and of course, what would later be the disastrous marriage to Julia, Augustus' daughter. So, but let's begin with discussing the marriage to Hispania as first, and how his marriage to her was actually rather quite the match, to put it that way.
We're talking about a time in history where arranged marriages are very much accepted, and they're done for political and maybe financial, but mostly political reasons. And Vipsania Agrippina is the youngest daughter of Marcus Agrippa, the great Marcus Agrippa. I always have to think of him in that way, who was the son-in-law, best friend, most loyal and defender of Augustus. I find him endlessly fascinating as an individual. So Tiberius comes in. He's betrothed to Vipsania at a very young age, and when the age is appropriate, then they marry. So that would have been typically something when she might have been 13 and he'd be something like 16. So they believed in young marriages, and everything we know is that they were blissfully happy. It's one of those interesting moments in a man's life, I think, where he finds the contentment with a partner, and they live life in the well-heeled way that an aristocratic couple would. And the tragedy is he's not allowed to keep it.
So and they have a child as well, from what I remember.
They have a child who, in fact, is called Drusus. Drusus after his brother Drusus. The way that Romans often named people was they would adopt the father's name, and then if that was taken, the next child might take, for example, an uncle's name or a brother's name. And if it's a female, then she would take the female form of the clan name. And in this case, so for example, she's name is Vipsania because it's the Vipsanii who are the tribe from which Marcus Agrippa comes. So Marcus Agrippa, who is this great man who in lots of ways defies capturing, because I think is instrumental in this period of history. and yet deliberately goes out of his way to try and keep a low profile, if I can put it that way. Someone like Tiberius would have found it, I think, quite hard to wrestle with, because the whole Roman psyche is really about public display of achievement. And all his family is about boasting. We were consuls, we were dictators, we did this, we won all these. And Marcus Agrippa sort of doesn't do those things. He subsumes his achievement in favor of Augustus. So whenever he wins something, it's Augustus gets the prize. If there's a victory somewhere, or a building, that's kind of dedicated to Augustus. And I think it's interesting to try and understand, and it still, to me, somewhat defies understanding, why an individual would be so devoted to a friend that you almost, everything you do doesn't matter because you do it for her. It almost hints it's a kind of platonic love, I think, is the only way I can really describe it. And so Tiberius, it becomes the son-in-law of this man in marrying Vipsania Agrippina, and then tragically in 12 BC, Agrippa dies. And he has been married himself to Augustus's own daughter, Julia, and by her has had 3 children, at least that I know of. And the thing about Roman records is that sometimes they only mention some and they often forget to mention others. So we're never quite sure necessarily the size of families.
There's not a real great continuity in Roman lines.
Well, that's right. I think Roman historians write with slightly different interests than we do. So writing as a political military historian that I am, it's endlessly frustrating to find the details of
You
campaigns.
want the continuity.
Well, I want details, and often Roman historians won't give me details, or even worse, someone like Cassius Dio will say, there were lots of battles during this period, none very important to
Which
mention.
battles?
Yes, exactly. And then you're into the realm of guessing or speculating, which of course historians do at their peril, because of course you need facts. So to get back to our main point here, which is Agrippa is dead at 12. He leaves a widow called Julia, who is Augustus' daughter, and Augustus needs his daughter married to someone, and they look at Tiberius, who is head over heels in love with Vipsania, and he is told to divorce her. And he goes through any number of different emotional pleadings with Augustus and his mother, Livia, to please not do this. And in the end, he has to just go along with it. And it's dreadfully tragic because, this person, who's still a young man, 30s, is really bereft at this loss. And is basically told, you're doing this for the good of the family, you're doing this for the good of me. I like what you're doing. I need you on board, says Augustus, and Tiberius has to be loyal. But he's a Claudian at this point, and they marry. They try to make a go of it. I think they have one child.
Sorry for interrupting you again. And like you said, they have one child, but there's a hash. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I want to mention this because Julia is kind of the rebellious daughter in. I think we should mention this as well, because Julia is kind of the rebellious daughter in the Augustus family. I think it's needless to say, for those who may be familiar with it, with this history.
I think she's, she ironically, like Tiberius, is one of history's character that's been given a very bad rap. You think about it, right? So she is the daughter of Rome's most important individual. Who's
very family oriented and who's very strict on family values from my understanding.
That's at least what he says in public. All right. and Julia is effectively a chattel that's kind of moved around whichever suits her father's needs, and you can imagine that would really be hurtful. So she is asked to marry Agrippa, who is quite a bit older than her, and she does that.
But that was not common in that time.
No, absolutely not. But my point is, I don't know that anybody ever asked her, "What would you like to do?" And the result is,
no one asked women in that time what would you like to do, to be fair?
Well, that's the general impression. It's very much a patriarchal, not a matriarchal society. Women are not supposed to participate or be seen in politics, which is an interesting dimension. And in the case of marrying for love, you can imagine that if Tiberius thought he'd married Vipsania Agrippina for love, that was being torn away from him. And now he's being told, instructed to marry this other lady. And there's this really sad story where, having been divorced from Vipsania, is walking down the street and catches sight of her, and she has to dart away, and he basically rushes to try and speak with her, and Augustus finds out about this and basically bans him from ever seeing her again. They can't even be friends. And what's fascinating is this relationship clearly haunts him because she goes on to marry another man. And even when he is emperor, right, this man, who's her new husband and is for decades, becomes this real sticking point in Tiberius's life, a figure that he despises. And the impression I have is that it may not just be the politics that's the reason for this abrasive relationship, but the fact that he took his
It's
wife.
almost Shakespearean in a way.
Yeah, and I think what this highlights to you that in history, the other part of history, apart from the inquiry, is the story piece. We're talking stories of people, and what I got out of this, and these are not new stories I found, but these are ones. But when you go deeply into the research for somebody, it's going on the emotional journey as well as the factual journey of the things that they did to try and understand the people, what made them do what they did, and it must be terribly sad, if that happens to you, and I have to imagine damaging at some level.
Now, do forgive me if I'm jumping a little bit ahead because we've been talking for almost an hour already, so we have to jump ahead a little bit. But we have to talk about his. Again, we have to go back to his military career, and we have to talk about his role with a young soldier called Germanicus, and of course we discussed him in one of the first episodes we did. Actually, was about Germanicus, but we have to, of course, talk about Germanicus as well, and Tiberius, because of course he would eventually come to adopt Germanicus as his son and potentially successor, or did he try to murder him? That will come up later. But let's talk about Tiberius and Germanicus, and again we've been talking for an hour now, but so we have to try to move along with the story. But we have to, of course, this is an important part of Tiberius' lives as well. Is Tiberius and Germanicus' relationship.
So to set it up, I'd say this: Tiberius had an outstandingly close relationship with his brother, the younger brother Drusus, and he was a successful campaign commander in his own right. In fact, Tiberius and he fought alongside each other in an interesting campaign in the Alps in 15 BC, and they were very successful in how they went about doing that. Drusus is rewarded by Augustus with a promotion to being the governor of Gaul, and then given the challenge of actually pacifying all the lands across the Rhine, which are called Germania. And at the same time, Tiberius is actually given the Balkan region, the Western Balkans, which is called the Illyricum, to pacify. So in this division of the spoils, they're both brothers with only about 3 years between them in age, but they both have a natural belt and talent for warfare. The glory seems to go to the younger brother Drusus, because he's given basically a whole new part of the world, on the edge of the known world, effectively to conquer. Whereas Tiberius is given this: we've been here before. These people never know when they're surrendered, and I have to keep going around and beating them up.
So it was Drusus was potential successor to Augustus in the first place, and not Tiberius. So was it Drusus who were supposedly to become the next imperator, or not, princeps, or was it, was that the original plan in Augustus?
The teasing piece, I think it's in Suetonius, the Life of Claudius, where we have two paragraphs that describe the early life and career of his father, Nero Claudius Drusus. And when he dies in 9 BC, he is in deep Germany after a 4-year campaign, falls off his horse. The horse falls on him, breaks his upper leg, and it's very rare that you recover from that breakage. You get blood poison effectively. Tiberius races to be with his brother, and at the age of 29, Drusus is dead.
So sorry, we should mention that they did have. I think we mentioned this, and don't remember if we mentioned this, but they did have quite a good relationship. They were quite close, Drusus and Tiberius, as brothers as well.
That's certainly the impression. There's nothing in the records, bar one thing. That there's this interesting story where apparently Drusus writes to Tiberius, and in this candid personal letter, says that we really must persuade stepfather Augustus to stand down. We have to go back to the old system, where the people elected assemblies and magistrates and so on, and this becomes known to Augustus. This letter becomes known, and they have to sort of try and understand what it means, and they think, oh well, Drusus is just tired. The war is taking its toll on him, and so on and so on, and the relationship otherwise is supposed to be very good. There is one reference to the word odium, which is hatred in Latin, and the trouble with so much of what we have in the ancient sources, we often have just one version. We can't corroborate it with anything else, and this is one of those cases. So in 9 BC, Drusus dies. Tiberius then has to take on the command of that campaign, but also he starts to take on a sort of an uncle's duty towards the family. So at this point, when Drusus died, his older son is basically called Nero Claudius Drusus, after his father. And then there are a string of other kids, including in 10 BC the young Claudius, who will himself become emperor later on in the Roman history story. But on the death of his father, Drusus, the Senate goes into this period of mourning, but also award giving to the name of the brother. And in fact, they give him the name Germanicus, which means conqueror of Germany. I joke, it's the Germinator. He's the guy that has conquered the German people, rightly or wrongly, but that's the name. And the oldest son is able, through inheritance, to adopt that. And in fact, he switches his name from Nero Claudius Drusus to Germanicus Claudius Drusus. I have to remember this sequence, and that's how we know him now, as Germanicus. So in the years that pass, he goes through the same kind of career that other Roman boys will go through, and when you get to the point where Tiberius and he are having to work much more closely together, and I think what we're doing is now we're probably approaching the period of when Tiberius has become an emperor, right? That relationship becomes much closer, and potentially it has more friction, because Tiberius, when he takes on the role that was previously what Augustus did, in AD 14 when Augustus dies, and Tiberius takes on the role of princeps, and all the sort of various other titles and powers that kind of go in that bundle. Germanicus is actually the governor of Gaul. Very early on in the weeks of the accession of Tiberius, mutinies break out with the legions along the Rhine and on the Danube. You'd mentioned earlier that Vipsania and Tiberius had a son. Well, he was called Drusus, and we now call him Drusus the Younger, as opposed to Drusus the Elder, who was the father we talked about seconds ago, the father of Germanicus. It does get very complicated in Roman family trees, let me tell you. So both of those young men, Germanicus and Drusus the Younger, son of Tiberius, have to deal, they're sent out to deal with mutinies along the Rhine and the Danube. And after some politicking and negotiation, they manage to quell the mutinies. And what that proves to Tiberius is that his two sons, his adopted son and his natural son, are loyal to him. If anybody was going to overthrow Tiberius, it would have been at that moment in time, and those two men did not do it. In fact, they showed immense loyalty, and in fact, they even got the army to show its loyalty. And at that point, you don't really see any other further problems with that. The problems that the army had, it seems not to have been anything to do with the fact of their commander-in-chief, although there was a suggestion that, well, actually, Germanicus, you should be the emperor, we'll vote for you, was in fact labor and conditions, pay and conditions. A lot of Romans signed up for 16 years, and if you think about it, the record keeping is on pieces of wood and papyrus documents, and they're kept in a building called Principia, and very often that's far away from the soldiers are fighting. And you may well say, this is the 16th anniversary of my signing up. I'm retiring this year, but they don't remember to do that. And the documents are 50, 60 miles away, and they're not going to get back to that building till the end of the season. So already now you're running into, if you will, injury time, to use a sports analogy. And this was happening more and more. A lot of soldiers were over-serving their time, and they wanted to retire. So what both Drusus and Germanicus were involved in doing was dealing with the labor dispute. And I think they did it quite significantly well.
So we already discussed quite a lot of things going on around Tiberius at this point, but now it's time, and I'm sorry if I jump in a little back and forth, but we have to discuss his first exile, as they call it, or as it's famously called, because before Capri, he also decided to do an early retirement, as we would call it today. So, and they choose Rhodes, the city of Rhodes, island of Rhodes. So let's talk about his retirement to Rhodes, or early self-imposed exile, if you will. What caused him to do this, exile in the first place? What? And I think it's fair to say that Julia was Julia a part of why he chose exile? The marriage, his second marriage, was a part of it, or what made him go into exile?
As in so much of Tiberius' life, it's complicated. So at this time in his life, he's 36. He's been successful in war. He's been successful in his political career, but he's lost a wife and he's lost a brother. In the meantime, the sons of Julia, particularly Caius and Lucius, who were the two young sons, are now moving into their teenage years. And Augustus has seemed to make it quite obvious that he's looking at those two men who he has adopted. Even while Agrippa was alive, he adopted his two sons, which is a remarkably unusual thing to do, but is an indication of the level of loyalty that Agrippa had to his best friend. So in the meantime, Agrippa, as we said, in 12 died. His sons they're growing up fast. And the Roman populace, that the Roman people really like these two kids. They see them as being sort of young, good-looking, potential heroes for them, in the same way that Drusus and Tiberius had been heroes as well. But they're a bit older now, right? They're in the 30s, and these kids are in their teens. And one of the things that Tiberius actually has to do is to take one of the boys actually over the Rhine on a campaign and keep him alive. And when he comes back, everybody gets money, and it's all great and good.
And I'm sorry for interrupting you, but we should also mention that we mentioned the title Imperator earlier, and Tiberius has been a few times now honored with, I believe, with the title Imperator as well at this point, right?
Yeah, so the work that had been left unfinished by his brother, he started a campaign in 12, for each year all the way through to 9, was campaigning as he moved basically from the Wadden Sea all the way towards the Weser River, and actually having some success until his death, and then his brother takes on that campaign, and it becomes more of a war of pacification where they're trying to keep the tribes that they had defeated pacified to try and put patchwork together a province. And this is very familiar to Tiberius because this is exactly what he's been doing in Illyricum. for many years. It always seems that in Tiberius's military career, it's always having to make things work that other people did, which seems to be the overriding characteristic. And there's not much glory in that because the other guy won all the prizes and victories, and you just got to keep doing things and holding things down and stopping people rebelling. And it's just a bloody business. And this is the sort of warfare that Tiberius is involved in, but he's good at it, and his troops are very loyal to him, and they admire him as an individual. He's a fair soldier, and they like
Just
that about
stern
him.
but fair soldier.
Stern but fair, and I think that goes back to the fact that his Claudian ancestry sort of has examples of where they were heroic general type characters that really put themselves out there in danger, and that's something that soldiers wanted to see. That he wasn't going to be a man who'd stay in the tent. I should actually add, like sometimes Octavius did, Augustus did, but no, he's pretty much out there with his troops. And by the time you get to the death of Drusus, he is now the only sort of living relative of any stature in Roman society who's one of the Claudians, and he still carries that forward proudly. But in the meantime, he's seen these young Julian sons, Caius and Lucas, come up, the children of Marcus Agrippa and Julia. And it seems to be, I mean, there's a number of different interpretations, some of which are actually expressed in the Roman sources and maybe some of my ideas too. But, he is 36. He's been pretty much on the go all the time. Since his late teens, 16 through 18 and then 20 all the way through the years since, fighting wars on behalf of Augustus. And he's done that pretty much without complaint. He has done that. It's a hard, grueling, not a terribly comfortable lifestyle. And of course, his life technically is at risk all of this time as well. In fact, there are a couple of stories where, in fact, he was at risk. There was an attempt by a German to try and attack him. Why he seems to have decided to escape at that point baffles historians. And I think one way is to say he was tired. That was, I think, his initial story. The other story was, well, actually, because of his stature and his name and the fact that he was regarded as an important man within the family of Augustus, he sort of overshadowed the rise of these two younger men, Caius and Lucas. And so the idea was that he would just go away, and then these men could have the full spotlight, and they could actually go and develop their talents as they would go without him being constantly on the stage. And what's interesting is it appears that's not exactly what Augustus had in mind at all, and he's saying, no, you must stay. I've got things you have to do. This work over here in Illyricum isn't finished, and this other thing I need to have done. And Tiberius digs his heels in, and his mother tries to plead. And in the end, after pleading and ranting and raving, and even a 3-day hunger strike, which is quite remarkable, Tiberius is allowed to go, and he chooses Rhodes because on his way back from the negotiations with Parthia, he'd stopped at Rhodes, and he liked it a lot. And it appealed to his sensibilities towards Greek culture. He seems to have liked Greek poetry and athletics and all of those sorts of things. So while being proudly Roman, he was certainly amenable to the finer things of Greek-style living. And then he literally took a boat with a small number of friends and servants, and off they went and lived for some years in Rhodes. And much to the consternation of the Roman people, certainly the great disappointment of his stepfather. Sorry?
From my understanding, it kind of backfired. The exile, self-imposed exile, kind of backfired on him.
Well, part of the problem is that it's very difficult for Augustus to explain it to people. When he basically pleaded, could someone please convince this man to stay? I need him. He's my right-hand man. I mean, I don't have Agrippa anymore. He is my Agrippa too, number two. So when he left, I think there was a sense of, on Tiberius's part, that he was now as free, he was his own man, he could retire in the way that I think that modern people understand it. But he could play about being a Greek philosopher, and he could go to classes, he could meet with people, he could play games and ride horses and throw spears and all that stuff. People would come and stop and meet him, but actually his image in Rome begins to corrode. And in fact, there are people that are actually actively out to try and really destroy his image. And over time, he begins to realize, yes, he's made a mistake. And at this point, then he turns to his mother, Mum, could you please intercede with Augustus, please, to let me come back? I mean, I'll be very quiet. I won't make any noise. And Augustus says, well, it's really up to the two sons, Caius and Lucas. I mean, what do you think, Caius? And, the verdict is it's too early. And then eventually when Caius agrees, then it turns out that he can go back. What's very interesting is one of the enemies that Tiberius had made in all of this, in the time that Drusus, his brother, and he were campaigning, for one brief year, Augustus and Tiberius went to Gaul. And there they found that the governor, whose name was Marcus Lollius, had really not done the job properly. In fact, there was a military disaster. It was with the loss of some eagles of a legion, I think it was the 5th Legion, which was a problem because if you remember, Tiberius had only got a bunch of eagles back from the Parthians, so to lose a whole new load of eagles in his own watch, that wasn't very good publicity. So Lollius was summarily dismissed, Tiberius is put in his position, but this hatred between Lollius and him really takes hold. So by the time that Tiberius is out in Rhodes, and Caius himself is actually on campaign in the area of Armenia, Lollius is actually working to undermine the reputation of his rival, Tiberius. And then the story comes out that Lollius has actually been accepting bribes and money from the Parthians. And Caius is told this and realizes he's been had for a dupe, and then finally accedes to Tiberius coming back to Rome, where in that time he lives a very low-key life. He basically brings his young son, Drusus, who is now just about 13, to the public gaze to enroll him in the public record office. And then the process of rehabilitation begins. And having, in the meantime, so Lucius dies of some disease when he's going out towards Spain. And then Caius, who's been out in Armenia, is affected by some disease caused by a wound, and he dies. So the only man left standing is our Tiberius. And this reconciliation between Augustus and Tiberius begins to take place. And more you find over the following years, that the following 10 years, Tiberius is given again positions of superiority in management and administration, and becomes very clearly earmarked to be some kind of successor.
So let's talk about the transition to, and again, I'm sorry for skipping ahead a little bit, but let's talk about the transition. I'm sure that is what people are most excited about. His transition to emperor or princeps, if you're going to use the more academic term. so let's talk about his transition to princeps.
It's interesting. So I live in the United States, right? And we talk about peaceful transfer of power. There is a process. The outgoing
Not very
president,
peaceful the last 2 elections, was it?
I'm not going to comment about that. But for a great number of years, the outgoing president would literally yield. There'd be a swearing-in ceremony, and the new president and the cabinet takes over. You have to imagine that in the time between Augustus and whoever's going to come after, there's not been a prior example. There is no playbook. There is no set of rules. Augustus didn't make any rules, and here's the reason why.
I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but and to the noise of my listeners, perhaps, but we have to remember that kings was kind of a bad word. It was a cursed word in Roman society at this point, because the 7 kings of Rome from the earlier. So he wasn't a king, other kind of old in all but name, to put it that way. So it couldn't be like a succession of kings, to put it
exactly
that way.
Right.
So that was a kind of controversy as well.
That's exactly right. And in fact, there's no title with medals and crowns and things to hand over and say, okay, our new emperor is this. But what had happened was that, you remember I talked about the cursus honorum, which is the race of honor. There are titles in there. There are consuls. There's tribunician power. There are other sorts of laws and prizes in power terms that Augustus had accumulated. And significantly, Tiberius had got a lot of those powers too. The big difference was the name Augustus. So Augustus means the revered one. It imposes on the name authority, which comes from the Latin idea auctoritas, prestige. And you've got to remember that it wasn't something that Octavian, when he was in his teens, and then as Augustus in his 40s, 50s, was able to acquire because it was something that you could just be elected to do. He had earned it by virtue of doing all the things he had done in his life, winning battles, appointing things, settling treaties, and all the rest of it. And this gave him immense authority, prestige, which Tiberius had in some part because he'd won battles and he'd been a loyal servant of the Roman Commonwealth and so on, but he didn't have that as a title. So when Augustus dies, and it's actually on the 19th of August, and Tiberius was actually on the way to complete a new mission, that he'd been sent off to Illyricum yet again to try and sort out some problems for Augustus, and then had to be recalled quickly. He arrives just back in time to have a quick conversation. Apparently,
I'm sorry for interrupting you again for the 10th time this episode, but I think I want to ask what made Tiberius the most eligible, such that next in line for Augustus. Why not, say, for example, Germanicus or any other candidate? What made him the most, no, I just don't have the word in my mind right now, but what made him the most convenient, to put that for the lack of better words, successor in line of Augustus?
a number of things. The first thing I think is we should never underestimate the ability of Augustus to see talent in people. It's amazing. When I wrote my Augustus at War, and I became aware of the fact that the legates, the praetorian legates in charge of provinces and tribunes, hundreds of grades of officers had to be chosen by him personally on an annual or triennial basis. And what he was doing was bringing on talent. So we tend to think of him as being as this sort of somewhat remote figure, but I think he's very hands-on, constantly talking with people, getting advice from friends and people who knew about things. And in the way that the late Queen of England was someone with great connections and networks. I mean, Augustus is that same person. So he knows good people. He also knows bad people who to stay away with, or how to work with both of those kinds of people to achieve given ends. Tiberius was the most obvious candidate. On the first level, he had adopted him. So at the time that the two sons died, in 480, he adopts Tiberius, he adopts Germanicus, and he also adopts the man that we call Posthumus Agrippa. So there are three people who've been adopted, but the first in that line of command is as the natural successor is Tiberius. So that's kind of a matter of will and testament.
Purely because of the adoption.
Yes, so that was an adoption. Yes. So at that point, and this is really interesting, he no longer is Tiberius Claudius Nero, he's Tiberius Julius Caesar. So he loses his connection with the Claudian family. He now becomes a full subscribed member of the Julian family, as does his son, Drusus, as does his adopted son, Germanicus. And it's really interesting. So at that moment in time, you can say he's breaking his historical link with the old family, and he is now very much in with Augustus. And it's fascinating because now, in a way, his ancestry goes all the way through Julius Caesar's family and ultimately ends up with Venus. It's a whole interesting line of sort of mythological connections there too.
And that's a whole other episode for the future.
Yes, exactly. So the thing is the adoption. The second thing is just through a lifetime of loyal, dogged performance through all the campaigns he fought, and just the other things that he did to be there and loyally carry those things out. Yes, he had divorced his wife at Sunny. Yes, he had married Julia, even though it wasn't a big success, and that saw ultimately Julia being exiled.
She ended up in that, yeah.
Yeah, and then of course Tiberius himself has to recoup his good name, having himself gone into exile. But as events turned out, I think bar none he was the best candidate. It would not have made sense for anybody else to be chosen by Augustus to be a successor, given the fact that there is no title of emperor, that there is no king. It's an autocratic sort of a role that he's created, but it's still precarious. That the way that Augustus set it up is that all the machinery of the state, so the people's voting committees, and, for example, the Senate, and all of the different magistracies and the various grades, and all of the governors that he had to appoint, they were responsible to him, but the Senate was responsible for all the things to go with the Mediterranean, the consular provinces. So it was always a sort of dual system, but he contrived that his power became more supreme over everybody else's. So people have coined this expression primus inter pares. I've not yet found that in Latin in the Roman books, but that's a name that's a word or phrase that conveniently sort of explains the presentation, which is say, and he actually says it in his Res Gestae, that basically I am amongst colleagues. I am an equal member, and it's been my high honor to be called father of my country and all these other great honors. And what it meant was at the time that he dies, what the heck do they do? And Tiberius's first instinct, he is able to come with the body of Augustus to Rome, and it's laid in state and prepared for its funeral. And the Senate is already asking the question, are you going to now succeed Augustus? You're going to take on the role. And from what we can gather, there are really three sources. There's Suetonius, there's Tacitus, and there's also various Patercus, but later Cassius Dio, where they give different versions of what actually happens. From what I've been able to piece together, the first day, Tiberius basically says, this day is to sort out the funeral, right? We're not talking about anything else about this, which kind of, bashes the nose of a few people out of shape. And the funeral then takes place, speeches are made, Tiberius makes a speech where he basically lays down the point. This man was unique. There's not anybody like him that could have done what he did. And in fact, it would take many men to do what he did alone. And I think that's a glimpse into what happens then in the days after, where Tiberius is asked, are you going to become the successor to Augustus? And he basically says, look, I think the job's too big. I think we need to have a committee of people. There could be lots of different people. And this gets him into this discussion with various members, including the man who then married his former wife, Ipsania, into this rather fraught discussion where they say, well, so which of the jobs do you want then? And this goes on for a while. And the way I perceive it is it's not so much Tiberius who other people will present as being, he was so hell-bent on actually being the emperor, he got really shaped by the fact that other people would dare to negotiate with him. The point is the negotiation was it, right? I think because of his Claudian heritage and because of his he knew how big and really hard the job was. Did he want the job? I don't know that we can actually say yes or no with any sort of clarity. But what we do know is he negotiated the job, right? So the idea was when finally he accepts that he's going to be princeps, right? It's seen within a more traditional idea of a leader of a Senate, that the Senate is expected to do what the Senate always did, and the people are supposed to do what they did, which is consult on things and vote on things, and the system will carry it on as normal. So the indications I get was that there was no intent that he was secretly ambitious to be emperor. I don't see that at all. In fact, I think the fact that he went to Rhodes tells you that he didn't kind of want that sort of responsibility.
And we discussed this. I remember we discussed this in our Claudian Dynasty 2-part episode as well a couple of years ago. He was a military commander. He enjoyed most of his time. He enjoyed being in the battlefield, and he enjoyed, being on the front line. He didn't necessarily like the aristocratic form of life. That wasn't the Tiberius that he liked.
I think that's right, and it's very telling, isn't it, that when the relationship between him and Julia broke down, he went off to Illyricum on his own. Many Romans would take their wives with them. So Drusus's brother took his wife Antonia with him to Gaul, for example. And Germanicus would take his wife to Germany. But he didn't. Tiberius didn't do that. He basically, this is my realm. I want you to stay out of it. And I think he found brotherhood and love.
He was a soldier.
I think and that rings true to me. I think that's part of it. Now, he was a political man. He was also known as a scholar, a legal scholar. He'd been judged in several cases and performed them very well. He knew and understood Roman law. And in fact, he was considered to be the most just. There's an inscription which basically calls him Justissimus, recognizing that, he was a stickler for following the letter of the law and so on. So you've actually got in Tiberius someone who perhaps is a constitutionalist, you could say. The Roman system is supposed to work this way, but is pragmatic, coming from his background in the army, to know that you couldn't in one fell swoop go back to another system. It was kind of what it was. And his job was to be the caretaker or the steward or the adult in the room. And it's also interesting to point this out. I think it's in Suetonius, where the point is made that by the time of Tiberius assuming this preeminent role, all the people that had lived at the Roman Republic that was known to Julius Caesar and Cicero were all dead. They had all lived through the time of Augustus, who ruled for 44 years, which for some people was a complete lifetime. They born and died in that time. So
there was a new bloodline of senators, to put it that way.
And all of that. And the interesting thing that it raises is in my head is that how could you expect a group of people to just switch back to an old way of governing when nobody knew how the old way of governing was? And sure, there were people in the Senate who were still, they remember talking to their dad and their granddad, and of course they read, the
back in my day.
Yeah, back in his day.
Back in my day, we had an republic.
That's right. But here's the interesting point: is that as far as the Romans are concerned, they always had their res publica, right? And so I was presenting just last week to an audience where I showed a coin of Constans II, which is around about 360 A.D., and it shows a frontal image of a Roman commander. It's Constantius II, and on the other hand is various sort of figures, holding up crosses and what have you. And then it says Gloriae Rei Publicae, to the glory of the res publica, to the glory of the Roman Commonwealth. So the Romans always thought of it as that. I think the difference is now that there was an imperial figurehead who was a sort of an autocrat to some degree. And the further away from Rome you went, it was probably much more decentralized. I mean, your world then shifted to a province, to a city. And cities had as much participation in elections for aediles and duowirs and all the other kind of roles that cities relied on. Even if the city of Rome didn't have so many elections and those sorts of things, the Senate was still passing decrees. There were still laws being acted, even quite late in Tiberius's reign.
So let's talk about its early times as a princeps and up until the time that he moves to the island of Capri, as is the famous English word, to use the English term Capri. Sorry, I don't know how the Latin word is pronounced, but let's talk about his time as a princeps from until he moves to Capri and what made him move to Capri in the first place.
I think it's important to understand. So the characterization of Tiberius in a lot of history books, unfairly, is that he's this tyrant. That he rules as an autocrat.
He's a deviant to, have orgies everywhere.
Well, and that particularly after Capri. But I think the evidence points to a different guy. He is a very conscientious, fully engaged member of the political society. What's amazing, as I was writing the chapters where from AD 14, for example, to AD 27, he goes to courts, he goes to Senate proceedings, he goes to all of these essential meetings of senators and people and magistrates. He's hearing court cases from delegates that come over from Asia or from Spain or wherever they're coming over. They're asking for guidance on this and that and all the rest of it. If anybody's familiar with the story of Paul, when he then goes to Rome to meet with the emperor, the emperor is the sort of the last court of resort, right, for communities. They go to him because they're Roman citizens and they said, Civis Romanus sum, we need you to rule on this stuff. Tiberius, for years upon years upon years, is doing that. And I got to a point where I was writing about these things, and I'm thinking, how much of this was to him a drudge? How much of this was just a grinding wheel? It was a never-ending burden that he had to mostly do on his own, because there were all these grandstanding senators on the one hand, and there were people who were trying to fawn over him. His natural inclination, he did not like to be... what's the word I'm looking? He didn't like people sucking up to him, right? He had a title, used my title, but he didn't want to be called Dominus, Lord. Don't ever call me that. He was reluctant to be called Augustus. Someone said, "Why don't we call you, for example, Patriae?" No, so, his name is Caesar, right? So he's often addressed as Caesar. In official correspondence, he can be Caesar and Augustus and other titles that go with this very broad categorization. But what you have to remember,
again, for the 13th time this episode, I wanted to apologize for interrupting you and taking drinking every time I say so. But if you want to play a drinking game, but it's also important to notice that we discussed this before, that no one really knew what the title of princeps or imperator were at this point. That it was a brand new title. I think we should also add that no one really knew what the title were. So if you know what I mean, like the title of princeps or imperator.
Yeah. So to give you an example,
it was still a brand new title.
It went back to the idea of being the first man in the Senate, princeps senatus, and it was a combination of like a chairman of the meeting, the person who was able to speak first on subjects. And Tiberius was very conscious of that, because he knew that if he was asked a question, today's discussion is the decision to do A or B. And if he made it known, well, I'm inclined to go with A, everybody else would go with A. There would be no discussion of B. So he felt that I'm actually not going to tell you what I want to have a debate about this. And this went on many, many, many times. And I think it's a glimpse into his psychology. He tries very hard to say, look, you have to discuss, this is what your job is. And I will cast my vote, but you thrash out the various issues, and you arrive at a reasoned conclusion. When he's trying Calpurnius Piso, for example, he actually makes the point. Even though my son died, you must discount my opinion on this, my emotions as a father. You must look at the merits of the case and make your decision based on those. And I think this is a remarkable characteristic for someone that he's put in this position. He accepts it, but he does it to the best of his ability. And he is consul several times during his career, including when he's what we call emperor, which means that he is officially one of the two most important magistrates in the Roman Commonwealth. He has tribunician power, which means he can veto things if he doesn't like them, and he doesn't exercise that many times. Again, he's encouraging discussion with the Senate, and recognizing that the Senate is an important and mature body. He actually discontinues the voting in the popular assemblies and actually has all of those decisions made by the Senate. So if anybody in an old-style republic was saying, I trust the Senate to be the wise advisory body of the Roman people, he actually tried to make that so. That the frustration I think he had was not only the drudge of the work, but sometimes the reluctance of the Senate to really take on board its full responsibilities. And did he help to make that always happen? The case could be argued that he didn't go the whole way, but I think he did a good job in actually making the culture, the space for the Senate to deliberate and make its decisions on things. So by the time you get to when he's 68, and let's remember, he is 68. I'm not 68. You're not 68, but many people listening are, have already lived a lifetime in work, right? And in our modern society, we'd say, we're now retired. We're still expecting him, like a king, like emperors, to carry on and on and on and on. My read is he never imagined that that would be the case. I think there are a couple of tragedies in his life. Not these are separate ones to the divorce from Vipsania and the loss of other
Yeah.
people in his family, like his brother. I think there's another one. I think that it's quite possible that when he took on the responsibility of being princeps of the Roman Commonwealth, that he imagined that 10, 15 years from now, between Germanicus or my son Drusus, I could train them and bring them on board, and then I can retire. I can actually
Yeah.
literally abdicate. The problem is, in AD 19, Germanicus dies. And I think it's AD, is it 24, 25, that Drusus dies. Different circumstances, but the two people who he had maybe earmarked to become his
Yeah.
successors are gone. He's then left with younger people in the family who are much younger and they don't have the sort of experience. So he now spends time
And
with
no
them. He's also,
experience should be had in
yeah,
either
but
ruling or military command.
yeah, and these are the younger sons, by the way, of Germanicus. So it's interesting how he is taken under his wing, under his responsibility to raise the greater family that was Augustus's family. And he keeps finding disappointment. I mean, these people either don't live up to expectations, or that they're subject to bad influences. So by the time you get to the age of 68, he has made a friend in a man called Sejanus, that the English people
Yeah.
call Sejanus. And this is a gentleman who was an equestrian, who had proved to
And
be
he
very capable as the guard, the commander of the Praetorian cohorts, Praetorian Guard.
but
A
he's
role that he
very
takes.
much the villain of the story in
Well,
Tiberius'
well, I
life.
don't know whether he is a villain. I mean, so this is nothing. So what you have to remember is that Tiberius, in the way that Augustus did with Agrippa, and then with Augustus and Tiberius, I think what Tiberius wants is someone to share the workload. It's a massive undertaking. There's no professional civil service. Augustus had a tiny little group of freedmen, ex-slaves, who actually helped him. They were very educated, they're very smart men. And Tiberius seems to have had something very similar. We don't know their names. He also had a council of friends that he worked with to consult over different issues. In the meantime, Sejanus had established his credibility over a number of different events. He'd helped intercept a fire, which he stopped spreading around and destroying parts of Rome, and he did that selflessly. For example, he actually helped save the life of Tiberius when a cave collapsed over him at his villa at Spelunca on the shores of Campania. And he was a friend of his for something like 15 years. So we're not looking at somebody who has got a quick plan, I'm gonna go and take over. No, it is a long enduring friendship, one that's based on deep trust. And at a certain point, at 68, Tiberius decides, I'm going on a vacation trip to Campania. And he spends some time at this
Just
Spelunca
a
villa.
little bit vacation trip to Japan, just the entire rest of my life.
Very good. But what seems to be is that Seance encourages him. You know, it's a great idea, Caesar. Why do you go do that? Go and I'll look after things over here. I'll keep all the correspondence flowing. You'll be totally apprised of what's going on. You'll have no reason to worry at all. And
And
then
you
you
have to
get
remember, sorry for again, I'm sorry for interrupting, but you have to remember that Wi-Fi and it wasn't the 1 second instant correspondence like where you live in the States and I live in Europe. That you have 1 second of correspondence. It took time for
it takes
say
time.
a message from Capri to reach Rome. Let's just put it that way. You had to go to boat and then you had to rehearse to reach Rome. So it
But
took
what it
time.
means
It wasn't
is,
like a messenger today from Gmail or whatever social media you use. It took a few days before you got a mail
yeah,
in those days.
there was an imperial courier service, which Augustus set up, and it was like a pony race service, so that the mail would be passed from one rider to the next. And as you left mainland Italy, you take the highway system or you take a boat and then you move on to the next port. So there was always the ability to get correspondence. But the other dimension is that people had to be given authority to make decisions, right? So there was, when Augustus divided up the Roman world into kind of basically two parts, his provinces and the Senate's provinces, he delegated to the 8 or 9 people that reported directly to him, what to do.
But I'm so
So
sorry
what we
for
were, what,
yeah. We were talking about the Roman postal system. So I'm sorry for the title re-breaks, but we're back now.
Yeah, so the cursus publicus was the means by which, through a pony relay service, message get across, and then the Roman navy would take it if it needed to go overseas. So Tiberius spent some time at his villa complex at Spelunca. You can still visit it. It's very tranquil. There's a cave where you can see this place where the cave collapsed partly, and Sejanus actually saved Tiberius. They
Or
decide to
supposedly
then
saved.
most of it. That whole area around Baiae, Pompeii, Herculaneum was very much a place that Romans quite enjoyed going for vacation trips. And the very wealthy would either have villas at Stabia or they would have them at Baia. And Baia or Baiae, the Latin, was curious because it was a town without a forum. It was more a sort of collection of very big grand villas, and some had keys into the sea. And significantly, it had a reputation as a party city. The rich and famous had villas there. Tiberius decided not to go there. He decided that was not really to his liking at all. Augustus had done a deal years before with the city of Naples, so that he basically took ownership of Capri. And he built some villas there. And I don't quite know when it was that he spent time in Capri, but he at least had some luxury accommodation that he'd built on the island. And that's where Tiberius went. And I think very quickly saw it was like Rhodes to him. It was nearer to Rome. It had the same sort of atmosphere. It had sort of like a Greek culture. Interesting enough, they had dinosaur bones. When the engineers were building the foundations for one of the palaces there, they found these great big reptile bones. They didn't know what they were. They thought they were like giants or mythical figures, but we probably now would recognize them as dinosaur bones. So he decides
You
he's going
didn't
to.
mention that in your book.
I did. Did
Did
yes.
you?
Yes. If you find the page relating to the Villa Jovis, which was the name of the palace that he seems to have made his own, you'll find it in there. But yeah, it's somewhere around about page 363, something like that.
Ooh.
360, 180. No, hold on. Where's that? I don't have my glasses on.
We can leave that after in the after notes.
163, not 360.
Yeah.
163. So he decides that's where he's going to set up home. And now he's thinking probably, I've got a guy I can trust in Rome. The Senate is beginning to show some proficiency in being able to run fairs on its own. My son, unfortunately is dead. But anyway, there are enough people who seem to be able to be competent to be able to run affairs. And anyway, the public service, the mail service is going to bring him, and he's constantly answering letters, what are called rescripts, and he's writing speeches which then get couriered back and read on his behalf there. So he doesn't miss a beat. He's constantly in the ebb and flow of Roman politics. What appears to happen is that Sejanus decides that he would like to be much closer to the emperor. He makes overtures to actually marry into the family, and it's interesting.
Does he like the idea of power that he has? When Tiberius is away from Rome, and he is kind of the princeps in all but
Yes.
name. Does he like the idea of kind of being a, for the lack of better terms, a J.D. Vance in modern terms?
I couldn't possibly come. but no, the interesting thing I think is that what Sejanus has for a decade or so been a loyal right-hand man in the way that Agrippa had been to Augustus. And there are no indications, it would appear, that Tiberius is aware of any untoward ambitions or there's ambitions for later on in life. He does approach Tiberius, could I marry into your family? I mean, I think you've seen what kind of guy I am. Tiberius is a bit snooty because he can be very much a snob sometimes, and says, well, really, I'm a patrician, you're an equestrian, it's not really for your class to marry into mine. And eventually an arrangement is made so a sort of like a distant member of his family can marry a relation within the family. So they are sort of tied at a lower level. In the meantime, Tiberius refers to him as socius labrorum, which is to say ally in my work. And it's a recognition that what he's doing is important stuff. Eventually he becomes consul with Tiberius, and Tiberius then becomes aware, through various rumors getting to him, some trustworthy and maybe others, but one seems very credible. And this is the insinuation of a plot to overthrow him. And Tiberius, in the way that he plans any military campaign, does this really intricate, very well thought out plan, which effectively involves the night watch, removing the Praetorian cohorts from their guard duty and switching in loyal members so that Sejanus can be invited to a meeting of the Senate, where basically a charge sheet is read and Sejanus is arrested. And then the Senate actually then tries and arrests and executes him. Tiberius doesn't do that, by the way. The Senate does that. I think that's an important distinction. News eventually gets to Tiberius and Capri that Sejanus is dead, and he then takes it upon himself to once again become more involved in Roman politics. There are instances, for example, where an amphitheater collapses, where he deals with that and helps the town. There are fires. There are several fires in Rome, which he in fact involves himself helping compensate people and finding them homes. He continues to do work in legal circles, so that when people come to him about property disputes in temples and cities and so on, he deals with those things. Significant, he deals with a financial crisis caused by a combination of assets in Italy not being liquid, and people then find themselves having to actually sell property, but they can't do it fast enough. And in fact, he comes in and acts as lender of last resort, effectively saving Italy, which I think is quite a remarkable thing. So in the period that he becomes princeps, he is far from being someone who is just living it up on an island. He's very much engaged in the day-to-day operations. The difference, I think, is by having the distance, he may have in his head be creating the idea that actually I am like the guardian, the patron, and the Senate that is doing the work. The city is working, right? I mean, the important issues are being addressed. The system is moving on. The one threat, which was Sejanus, has now been neutralized. Now he has to worry about what's going to happen after he is dead, and this is where other members of the family are fewer for him to choose from, but he has to sort of put his mind to that sort of thing. But in the meantime, he's doing the things he enjoys doing. He is an astrologer by hobby. He likes drawing up horoscopes. He likes growing cucumbers, would you believe, and other sorts of things, and pioneers a form of, I think it's a hydroponic kind of growing of vegetables. So this is a man, I think, has decided to
What is it about Roman emperors and vegetables? I'm just asking.
I suspect they're quite easy to grow.
Diocletian.
No, I think it's because they're just easy to grow, and he just enjoys this. I mean, again, it's a thing to do. So Augustus liked his pears. I'm sure other people liked other fruits in this, but
Diocletian liked his cabbages.
Well, look, so Romans fancied themselves as gentlemen gardeners, right? Cicero famously said that for him, the sort of ideal life was a library in a garden, right? And I don't find any evidence of a library in a garden, but certainly there's evidence that maybe there may have been a Greek and Latin library in the big villa Jovis that Tiberius spent most of his time. And what's also, I think, very interesting is the number of people coming through the building all the time. So it's a combination of the eagle's nest, a rather bad German dictator had under his care, and so the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. I mean, it's a place where entry and exit is controlled. It's luxury living. There's lots of things going on, but there are communities of friends who are there. And what's very interesting is we tend to think of Tiberius as being alone. He is not. He has a group of friends with him who stay with him for years on end. He feels betrayed on one occasion, and in fact, when he learns that two of them were involved in another plot which he didn't like, he had them executed. In the same way that Augustus would have done, by the way. They could not tolerate disloyalty. And what's very interesting is that as he goes into his 70s, I get the impression that he's still engaged in Roman politics and all the things that involve him. He doesn't travel so much, although, in fact, people tend to think of him as living and ultimately dying on the island. He doesn't. He actually travels back to the mainland. He even goes within a few miles
on
of
the
Rome.
mainland, doesn't he?
Ultimately, but even goes as far as almost within 4 miles of the perimeter of Rome, but doesn't go there. In the wake of the Sejanus problem, the Senate actually votes that it will make sure that anytime Tiberius wants to come to the Senate, he'll have a guard to make sure that he's protected and all of this sort of thing. But Tiberius never ever goes. But what he does, which is remarkable, in order to professionalize the hours of the Senate, he insists that they basically work a proper day with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They do the work. And he is, I think, what he's trying to do in a way that he would have done with the army is professionalize the machinery of government, even if the Senate didn't feel particularly inclined to do it. But he was the man setting the standards. All the way through the research I did, I was always impressed by the fact that high standards he set for himself, he expected of other people working for him. And the frustration so often was people would cut corners, or they think they could get away with it and be sloppy. And, you know, for his sensibility, it was frustrating. So I can imagine why he'd want to go to Capri to get away from this kitchen, which is constantly hot.
Now it's time to address kind of one of the most controversial aspects of that. One of them, may I add, we don't do this just about the next section, but I want to talk about one of the most controversial aspects of Tiberius' reign at Capri, and that is, of course, the famous treason trials, as they are called, and of course, the idea that, and if you look at Capri today, and you can see kind of the steep cliff hills where he supposedly murdered senators and he threw them over the cliff, supposedly, again, allegedly, supposedly. So let's talk about the idea that, but in your book, from my understanding, and I'm sorry if I'm interpreting this wrong, the so-called treason trials, they seem rather be having a logical conclusion behind them. They were actually treasonous senators. Again, from my understanding, I may be wrong here, but there seemed to be actually a reason behind the so-called treason trials that Tiberius had, that is one I kind of denounce for in history. So let's talk about the alleged treason trials that he had.
So let's get our terminology right. The Romans talked about majestas, which in English would be translated as majesty, and what it means is the majesty of the Roman people. And we translate that word as treason. So we think of treason as being something like a spy does in a state, an assassination of a national leader, just really bad criminal stuff that usually is associated with a capital punishment. The Romans had a broader view of that, and it goes back at least to Augustus and before, but Augustus kind of built on the body of, no, so it goes back to Sulla, Marius, and people like that. That the idea being that somebody can do something in the public space that stains the majesty of the Roman people. That means that you could say something, for example, or you could do something sacrilegious, and yes, you could do all the other things. You could assassinate or kill the Roman leader. So I think it's important to get those. So it's more than what we think of being treason. It's more a slur on the way the Roman people feel about themselves.
It's a simplified in a way.
It's what, sorry?
It's a simplified.
Well, I don't know if it's simple. I think in a way it's more complicated because then you've got to try and work out, well, is that treasonous or is that treasonous? And what's very interesting to me is that,
And
for
of course,
example,
what was treason in the time of Tiberius,
right. So for
compared to the
example,
21st century?
a lot of people, in order to ingratiate themselves with Tiberius, would say, "Oh, we saw that man swearing on a statue of Augustus, and this reflects badly. It's treasonous." Or this person said something bad about the Augusta, the mother of Tiberius. And Tiberius's attitude was, the gods can look after themselves. I'm not bothered. If you want to say bad things about me, say bad things about. This is about Roman libertas, right? So he's actually acting as somebody who believes in free speech, which is quite marked. Some people would think that he wouldn't, but
Yeah.
no, he is. Don't forget, he comes from the Claudian clan. He is an aristocrat. He's a patrician. He believes in these
Even
things.
though he hasn't renounced those, he still has the Claudian mentality, even as
Well,
a
he
princeps.
is a patrician Roman, and Romans believe in libertas. You said earlier about the fact of kings rex. The point is
Yeah.
that the point to rebel against dominatio, which is domination of a king, is libertas, is to express your mind. And it's very interesting the accounts that you get in Tacitus primarily, where over and over and over people are trying to bring charges against an individual, say, well, this man defamed the name of the emperor, and this one did this to the Augusta, and he basically says, stop it. I'm not interested. These are not things I worry about. Free speech, free men. This is what we're about. What is interesting is that there are other things which might involve assassination attempts or other kind of skullduggery. When you add up all the number of different cases which are reported in primarily in Tacitus, but some of them are in Cassius Dio, there are something like 50 cases of maiestas, 50 cases of treason. The overwhelming majority of those were either dismissed because there was nothing to hear, there was no case, or in this case, Tiberius said, this is ridiculous, I'm throwing the case out. There were a small number of cases where the charge merited because it was proven to be a charge which would have been treasonous in the sense that we would understand, and there were some executions. And in other cases, there were exiles, right? So the traditional way that people dealt with Roman citizens of a high
Or house
class,
arrest, as in some cases.
and house arrest
Right
too.
about in
The
the
idea
book.
was then to disengage them from Roman society. The punishment was to take them out of Roman society, so they would understand that it was a privilege to be here, and if you did bad things, that was taken away from you.
Yeah.
So I think it's, for example, during the entirety of Tiberius' principate, no more than 52 people were accused of treason, maiestas. Of them, nearly half were not found guilty of the charge. The 4 people who were innocent but still condemned were not the victims of Tiberius' wrath, but of the Senate. The Senate making the decision. So the people being thrown over the Tarpeian Rock or the Gemonian Steps, from my recollection, were really all the result of court cases, either through Sejanus, or through the Senate. So I think what's happened is that the people around him, and you could argue, yes, the buck stops here. I get that entirely. But Tiberius, in the way I have researched him, suggests a man who believes in rule of law, in the upholding of procedures and precedents, and transparency in that regard. And if people play funny business and they try and stretch the definitions of charges like treason, he sees through it. And he says, enough of this, I'm throwing this out. So I think when people read about him, they'd be quite surprised how much of the Roman stories are all designed to create the impression that he is a tyrant and someone who's using these as levers to try and impose his will. But when you read the stories and the detail, you'll find they get thrown out.
Yeah. So, and another famous happening that is on Capri is the alleged sexual orgies, and that he made his, now the successor Caligula participate in sexual orgies, or that all these events happening. I mean, and to be fair, this was the Roman society. This wasn't uncommon among the elite, maybe even among the older generation, as Tiberius were maybe, like you said, 70 years old at this point. So it wouldn't be. I couldn't look that it was entirely uncommon that were sexual orgies on Capri, but we read them especially in Caesar time, that there were all these sexual orgies that these women slept around, or that there were senators having prostitutes over. So, but that's another thing that we have to discuss in the occasion of Tiberius on Capri, is the alleged sexual orientations, and we discussed this in our Julio-Claudian dynasty episode, that Tiberius was a man of poetry. He was a man, who more enjoyed, being a poet, or reciting, history. He wasn't that kind necessarily that kind of sexual deviant that we think of him as today, from what I remember from our Julio-Claudian dynasty episode. So, what are your thoughts on the so-called sexual allegations that we have
So
against Tiberius on Capri?
it's a contentious subject, and don't forget we're recording this at a certain time in
Mm.
American history where certain files
Yeah,
people allege
yeah.
are being withheld even despite
Frank
promises of.
Reynolds, so all of a sudden,
But
that's a
I
joke.
think the reason I bring that up is that we're talking about a subject which upsets people,
Yeah,
and for very good reasons. And the point is, as we're learning now what is true and what is not true, what is invented and what is fact,
yeah.
so it is, I think, with Tiberius. And I think it's important to note a couple of things. One is that these allegations really appear in the Tacitus accounts and Suetonius accounts after he's dead, and they are all specifically about Capri. The
And
other
they are
thing that,
written said about a generation or decade later, by the way, or century later.
or even 50 years. Um,
Yeah,
on the other hand, what we do know, for example, a couple of examples, is that Lucas Vitellius, who was a young man in the imperial court at that time, was paid to be there, and my understanding is it was for uh, cavorting and sexual antics or what have you. And Caligula, when he went there as a young man, because that's where he grew up part of his life, really enjoyed dancing there. So what that tells me is there's some kind of really big party thing going on for the guests of Tiberius on the island. Then you get then you get into what is the language describing these events that happen. And what's interesting is that some recent studies, one by Edward Champlin, for example, has actually gone back to the Latin words and said, actually, we've got these meanings wrong. But standing back from it is a couple of things I'll say is that you've got to remember the Campanian area, for example, is already famous for Baiae. I mentioned that, for example, licentious living, parties, getting drunk, sex, so on and so forth. So that was in the background. So would it be unusual for Tiberius to do that? I don't think so. The second thing is he has lots of guests. You could get bored. This is entertainment. The other thing I would suggest is that we mentioned that Vitellius is being there, and Tiberius considered them to be prostitutes. So that's another thing you factor into this interesting mix. If you look at Roman wall paintings from Pompeii, for example, and Herculaneum, they are these grand trompe-l'oeil structures with naked figures of myths and legends, and we know that Tiberius liked the Greek legends. I think he's very partial to the Odysseus story. He saw himself as somewhat of a traveler around the islands. So could you not, for example, have where as part of these entertainments you would have masques or burlesques, where there would be people doing, they'd build structures and they'd have these reenactments of myths naked, because that's how that would have been done in the mythological period.
it is needless to be said, but he was the princeps, so he basically get away with whatever he wanted to do, because he had the power to, what were you going to say if he hired some prostitutes to have sex in front of him or with him? What were
Well,
you going to do against it?
so there is certainly that dimension. The other things I'm thinking about here are there are specific allegations, I think, in Suetonius about his minnows and swimming. And I think those are part of a vituperation which takes place after Tiberius dies. Edward Champlin thinks, for example, there is a source which feeds Tacitus and Suetonius, who is very anti-Tiberius, and this is written in the decade or so afterwards. And it's very interesting that vituperation, which is a Roman oratorical tool, you character assassinate your opponent in the
Yeah.
court. So, for example, you remember the speeches of Cicero against Mark Antony. They're all about belittling him. The letters that Octavian writes to Mark Antony and back, they're full of really sexual nastiness. That is part of the Roman culture. But I think what makes this particularly interesting is the fact that in the books themselves, Tiberius, in Tacitus's account, is being presented as a tyrannical figure. And within this idea of a tyrant, without control, the ability
He's
to do
also a
anything you want,
sexual deviant.
that is part of that character. And I think the reality is probably something a little more boring, in the sense that you could have sort of naked tableaus and things like this, and people telling the story of Hercules
Yeah.
or something, and you get a well buff Roman to act out the role. But Tiberius looks at this is just an could he have been
And
sexually active?
if I may, to do a comparison to say medieval kings or Renaissance kings, such as Francis I or Henry VIII or people like that, they have affairs with whomever they like,
Yeah,
and no one write anything bad about it because that was the common thing of the day, like medieval kings or kings such as Henry VIII. They had affairs all over the place, and they didn't even get a bad rep about it. But Tiberius is taboo because supposedly had all these sexual allegations. So you see the kind of hypocrisy going on here. Even today, in the 21st century, people think about Tiberius as this sexual, again to use the word diva, who had all these orgies on Capri, and that is kind of what he's remembered for
yeah,
in history, which is kind of like we talked about, the wrong perception of him. But it's you see the hypocrisy, whereas King Henry VIII had 6 wives, and
yeah,
what he gonna do? But no one, people try to pray, almost. I wouldn't say praise him, but almost praise him for it. So
yeah.
you see the hypocrisy here between say Tiberius and Henry VIII, for example.
Yeah, of course, Henry VIII was driven by the need to have a son. I mean, that you can see what that
Yeah,
was, and I think the implication
but he
in the
also
case,
had alleged affairs all over the
well,
place as well.
he certainly had plenty of those. So the way I think I would sum it up is the evidence suggests that, for example, the Villa Jovis was a place where visitors came and they were entertained, and those entertainments could have been representations of Greek myths and so on. So they would have been naked and they could have been frolicking and stuff of that nature. There, I mean, there's talk of figures running around the gardens and so on. It's almost like Versailles in a sense. I mean, they'd have all
Yeah,
sorts of kids running to create this idea of a rustic idyll. Were they sexually involving Tiberius? I somehow don't think so. But on the other
I
hand, just
mean, he
because
was like 70 at his age, right?
well,
So
all
how
I'm going to
and
say,
then
all I'm
and
going to
Viagra wasn't invented yet. So how
right,
how
but I'm
sexually
going to
can it
say
be?
right, but you know what? I mean, you only have to think of people like Picasso, for example, who was
Yeah,
a very active man. I was saying, just because he was in his 70s does not mean that he would not have had a sexual desire. The question is,
that's fair.
I think the question is that desire expressed in the way that the sources show, and I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think the other thing I want to bring here, in fairness to him as a man, is that he was heterosexual, that his most loving, fulfilling relationship was with Vipsania Agrippina. He tried because he was told he had to have a relationship with Julia. I am not aware of any other women in his life. You don't see any mention of other women. He doesn't seem to go with prostitutes. Claudius, for example, actually did. And in fact, one of his close friends was, in fact, a prostitute, and in fact was key in him eliminating one of his other wives, who was clearly Messalina, you may remember, who was actually trying to undermine his power. So when you look at him as an individual, I think what you end up with, there's the realm of the possible, and then there's a realm of the fantasy or the impossible.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the things that we read in the Roman sources exaggerate a lot of those things. But I'm saying within the context of the time, some of those things are possible.
Yeah. Now, the next thing before we not go to keep on talking for too much longer. We've been talking for 2 hours already, which is incredible considering the time of Tiberius. And I should talk another couple hours to be sure, but I'm not going to bore the audience too much more. But
They can just read the book.
that's it. That's it. But we have to talk about Caligula or Gaius Germanicus' upbringing in Capri as well, because again, according to the sources, that's kind of a seemed like a traumatizing, but time for Caligula. But as you said earlier, it's seemed to me kind of like he actually kind of enjoyed his time at Capri, and the free sexual, freedom he had on Capri, dancing and going partying as he grew older. But from and there's a Netflix show about him that came out a few years, somewhat years ago, that portrayed that he was scared for his life, on Capri, that because his family was killed or so on and so forth, that he had to watch his every move on Capri before alleged death was upon him. But what was Caligula's? Again, I'm using the most popular term here.
Yeah.
For him, what was his upbringing on Capri and his relationship with Tiberius as his successor? Like, in growing up on Capri, and again with all his family members in exile, his mother dying in exile. And I'm not gonna put, not that I'm necessarily anti-Caligula and not that I don't feel sympathetic for his upbringing, losing his family members, but we know what it will grow up to become. But I feel a bit sympathetic for that. But was it as bad as the sources seem to make it out to be, and his upbringing on Capri? So let's talk a little bit with Caligula's upbringing on Capri as well, and his relationship to that Tiberius.
So, to put these things in context, remember we were talking about how Tiberius would have looked at his two sons as being successors,
Yeah.
and they die. And then there are sons of Germanicus who, through various things and episodes, they are effectively killed, murdered, executed. And it seems to be largely at the hand of Sejanus, right?
Yeah.
Almost the
Again, he's
last.
actually the villain of the story.
Yeah, certainly can be interpreted that way. The person that's left from that family really is Caius, we call Caligula. And he had been brought up really as being the special kid, the darling. And in fact, when his mum and dad were putting down this mutiny we talked about, which seems a long time ago, Caligula was there. And in fact, Germanicus cleverly using, "We're taking my son away from you soldiers," kind of broke the mutiny, because they thought we've caused such pain and discomfort that our commander is actually taking away his son, and he's going to leave. So in fact, that breaks the meeting. He had therefore, I think, had a rather untypical upbringing. So whereas other members of the Julio Claudia family had had a fairly traditional one, where they would be educated at home and then at school, and they'd actually go through the various grades of the political system, he does not seem to have done any of those things. And that must have had an impact on his personality. In his teens, he then gets invited to go to Capri. The context of that is that the large group, 6, 7, 8, 9 people that Tiberius had with him, that pretty much lived almost permanently with him on the island, had either died or been executed, or in one case committed suicide. And Tiberius wasn't able to talk that man down from that. He just decided that's what he was going to do. So Tiberius becomes gradually lonelier into his 7th decade of life. So bringing in Caligula is a companion brings a bit of an energy to the place, because all the other people in the palace are guards or servants, maybe the librarian looking after his books, and the small team of freedmen that kind of keep his paperwork in order, and so on and so forth. So with these other kinds of entertainments going on, we have the story where Caligula really enjoys these wild dancing sessions, and Tiberius is supposedly he'll grow out of it eventually. But I'm just going to let him do it because he's a young kid. That's what he's going to do.
And I remember watching the Netflix documentary, and again, I'm not sure how accurate it is because it's been like 2, 3, 4 years maybe since that came out on Netflix. I don't know if you remember that one, but there was supposedly a scene where Tiberius watches Caligula having sexual relationships with prostitutes or whatever it is. So could
Yeah,
that have happened, or is it?
I don't see Tiberius being that kind of man. I really don't. After everything I've read about him and sort of the way that you form impressions through study, I think he was more conservative than people probably think of him as being. He was frustrated by, I think, sloppy sort of behavior. There are different stories of where, for example, he collects art, and he's shocked by the price of how expensive some of this art's become. There's one situation where mullet, a kind of fish that the Romans are very fond of, goes astronomically expensive. I mean, it becomes several years of pay of a Roman legionary in terms of costs. And basically, an inquiry is called, how can this possibly be? And there are other sorts of examples of where he just doesn't understand why it is that people seem to think it's okay to do this stuff. There's another instance where he's trying to get people to become more conservative in their day-to-day morals, and more Romans of wealth are buying Chinese silk and having them made into tunics, and a motion's put before the House of Senate to basically outlaw that, and it seems to be he's kind of in favor, and then someone suggests, well, actually, if this is what a Roman who spent all his life working and fighting and can reward himself, what's the harm in that? And he sort of kind of goes along with that. But the general sense is excess, luxury living, overindulgence are not how he looks at his own life, and he expects other people to copy that. In fact, one of the accusations was that whereas other people would bring a complete pig to a feast, he'd bring half a pig because he said, we're only going to eat half, we can have the other half tomorrow, kind of thing. It's as good, right? And again, these are interesting sort of little cameo moments, but I think they form a picture. Someone who's lived on campaign can certainly have luxuries brought to him, but he will tend to be more in keeping with the way that the soldiers work. And he lives his life in that style. So, you're looking at something like Capri, and, basically he's in the twilight of his life. And the Roman Empire, is ticking on, right? I mean, he's saved the financial crisis. The Sejanus is out of the picture right now, and so on. Sejanus has been replaced by another man called Macro.
Let's talk about a little bit about Macro and his right to power under Tiberius.
So at this point, we talked earlier about the plot to kill Tiberius, and Sejanus is identified as being the ringleader. The counter plot that Tiberius puts together brings
was it because
in
of the decline? And I think you mentioned earlier the decline of Sejanus' marriage. Was that part of the plot?
Explain that to me a bit.
So you know how Sejanus, I think you mentioned earlier, how he wanted to marry someone, but Tiberius declined. Was that part of why he decided to plot against Tiberius?
The issue was about having the tribunician power. So when a Roman politician got the tribunician power, that basically gave them immense power over the proceedings of the Senate, so they could veto things. So in this plot, this counter plot, Sejanus was lured into a meeting of the Senate, where he was supposedly going to be awarded the tribunician power, right? So he'd been a consul, he'd been through a lot of the other kind of grades within the Roman system, but to get the tribunician power gave him powers approximating those of the emperor at this point. And what Tiberius arranges is that the one of the heads of one of the units, in fact, is given the authority to take over from Sejanus as the praefectus praetorio, which is the prefect of the urban of the praetorian cohorts. and they withdraw the Praetorian cohorts and they switch in the Night Watch, which has been up to in the command of another officer who was also on side with Tiberius. So the takedown of Sejanus takes place, and none of Sejanus's troops are around to help him. They're back at the fort. And in fact, Macro goes there just to make sure that everything is taken care of, and he shows his insignia that in fact he's allowed to do what he's doing. And at that point, then, Macro is established as the number 2 within the ranking, right? So it's Tiberius, and Macro takes over from Sejanus. And he performs the similar sort of role as a gatekeeper in daily life and making sure that messages get to him and speeches and rescripts go back. But it appears to be that either he or Caligula, or maybe Macro's wife, sees an opportunity for influence beyond their position, and they start getting close to Caius Caligula as the years go by.
So let's round it up soon, but let's talk about the death of Tiberius and how Caligula become the successor of Roman Res Publica, and how this, because he doesn't die on Capri, as we mentioned. He would die on the mainland, not far from Rome, from my recollection.
Well, actually, it's very interesting. So again, to demolish one of the kind of tropes that people think that he lived all those years on Capri and never left. In fact, he left Capri several times to visit Campania, because you like Campania, to visit towns and temples, but also on a couple of occasions got very close to Rome, like I mentioned earlier. And on the final trip, decided that he would actually not go to Rome. He'd actually send messages back and forth. The Senate would do its job. He met with delegations, did business, and then headed back down towards Capri. There's a story. Apparently, he had a pet snake, and he, because he was into astrology and so on, was horrified when he saw this snake being eaten by ants, and he takes it as an omen that he must race back home to Capri. And on the way back, he stops off at a town with an amphitheater, and he takes part in a arrow shooting show of showing that he can still do this in his 70s. And he seems to catch some kind of sickness or illness, and he's then taken to the villa of Lucullus, who was one of the great Roman commanders of yesteryear, which he'd stayed at on previous visits. And he gets the help of a local doctor. And the evening passes where friends come round and pay respects, and they have dinner, and then gradually the guests leave. And Tiberius, interestingly enough, is portrayed in the situation of getting up to greet as they come in and then say goodbye to as they leave each of the guests. So you've got someone who, even in his 70s, who was frailer, who has manners and decorum and class. And then he seems to fall quite sick. And if you read the accounts, there are omens of the lighthouse in Capri shakes and collapses, and there's a storm and lightning and all that. It's all great sort of stuff that chroniclers would capture, because, of course, it can only precious the death of an emperor. But yes, he goes to bed, and there are several different explanations of what happened at Misenum, which is where the villa of Lucullus is, not on Capri, but Misenum. Misenum is famous because it was the base of the command of the Misenum fleet, and the Misenum fleet was the one which brought him his messages to Capri all the time. So it was a military base, and Lucullus, as I said, was a former military commander. So he would have been surrounded by military people the whole time. He gets sick, and quite how he died is the subject of, I think, 3 theories, and they're all recorded by Suetonius, one of which apparently comes through Seneca, who was Nero's tutor. And in fact, that one seems to suggest, at the simplest, I think Josephus, is that the natural causes, he was 77. I mean, he died, he just caught a cold or a stroke or something, and he had a heart attack and died. Well, we can't tell from the symptoms and the condition of the body afterwards. We don't have that information. There is another suggestion that he called for his slaves to feed him, and nobody heard him, and he basically fell off his couch. So that may be one of the ways he died. In the rather more sinister version, he's smothered with a cushion or a pillow by Macro, just to make sure he's hastened on, because Caius Caligula is in a hurry to assume imperial power. So between those 3 or 4 stories, it's not at all clear. My supposition is he just died of a sickness which hastened his death, and I think it was as uncontroversial as that. And what's amazing about it is that when Augustus had died all those years before, 22 years ago, there was a mutiny on the Rhine. There were no mutinies in the army. So what at the moment of his death, the empire is at peace. As far as I recall, there are no wars. The treasury is solvent. The Roman government is working. The governors are doing what they're doing, and actually the Roman Empire is ticking on like it's supposed to. That the effect of Tiberius's life was not as an innovator, but as someone who was a sustainer, sustaining engineering, if you like, to make the thing optimum efficiency by tweaking some things here and enforcing rules and changing policy as necessary. And he, when he needed to go and fight wars, like for example with Parthia, there was a skirmish there. They dealt with that. If there were mutinies, they dealt with that. If there were rebellions in different parts of the Roman world, they dealt with that. Remarkably, people felt prosperous under him. So when he died, the news goes out that the emperor's dead. That the reactions are mixed. A lot of people say, "Oh, joy! We can't believe that the old ogre is dead finally." He wasn't terribly popular. Is the impression I get from this. He didn't have the charisma, for example, of an Augustus, and certainly not of a Julius Caesar. But he had the competence to be able to make it worth. And I think if you were to sit Tiberius down in a room, he was not terribly bothered with being popular. This wasn't the army where it helped to be popular with the troops. He knew he'd taken on a job that wasn't
He
popular.
was quite popular among the troops when he was a general, though, wasn't he? Like, people generally liked him.
Yeah, and what I find interesting also is that the further away from Rome you go and you go into the provinces, particularly in the west and in the east, is that you look at things like coins and inscriptions. And the coins are really interesting because they're minted by local towns and communities.
And
they'll
you have
often
lots of pictures of the coins in the books, by the way, if I may add.
Thank you. Good. Coins are an important source of information to me, and they're genuine. I mean, they come from that time. They speak directly from those days about particular places and times. And you'll find the coins, for example, have the image of Tiberius on the one side, and there'll be an exhortation by the local town council, for having minted the coin. And what they clearly are showing is that they want to be associated with the man in Rome. They're in a small town somewhere in Asia or in what we now call Turkey, or maybe they're in Syria. But they want to be part of the big story, and the big story is represented by Tiberius in this instance. If they didn't like him, I don't think they'd put his portrait on the coins. They wouldn't appeal to those things. They wouldn't send their cases to be heard by him because they wouldn't have trusted his view. But they did. They actually went through all of this sort of conveyor belt of procedures, and he made it work. So when he dies at Misenum and the word goes out, and the initial reaction of some people is the old ogre is dead, so. And news then becomes aware that Caligula is now going to be the person taking over. He's a much younger man. He is the son of Germanicus, and he's very popular. So the initial response
There's a lot of expectations, to put it that way.
What Tiberius has done in his will, he's divided his estate effectively between Gemellus, who is the son of his son, Drusus, and also the son of Germanicus, who is Caius Caligula. And what happens very soon afterwards, and in fact I think it was a prediction that Tiberius made through his horoscopes, is that through the assistance of Macro, Gemellus dies fairly soon after, leaving Caius Caligula. So Caligula was able to exploit his position and his proximity to Tiberius to ultimately become the new princeps. And for the first 2, 3, 4 years, things looked okay. He was very popular. He did things which were in the populist style. But the problem that we have with him as an individual, as a ruler, he didn't have the depth of knowledge that either Tiberius or Augustus had in terms of how the whole empire was run. Didn't understand the army. He was a little kid when he was in it. Never served himself in the ranks. And what you end up with is someone who is ill-equipped to take on those responsibilities. And much as Tiberius would have wanted a Germanicus or a Drusus or even a Nero or another Drusus to take over from him, they all died he was out of options. And I suppose if there is a failure to Tiberius, it's that part of the piece.
So, just 1 second. So, now we come to the part where perhaps one of the chapters from what I remember we talked about off the record where you struggle the most right, and that is the chapters about Tiberius' legacy and how has been perceived by historical accounts. And I feel like we have to discuss this as well on this episode. I know we've been talking for quite a while, but I want to bring this up as well. So let's talk about Tiberius' legacy and how he has been perceived. We talked about this before we started recording. How much is Flavian propaganda and, Tacitus, I believe, wrote in the Flavian, during the Flavian dynasty. So, how much is Flavian propaganda that is anti-Tiberius and, pure anti-Julio Claudian propaganda? So, let's talk about how Tiberius has been perceived throughout the ages, because that is also a big part of your book as well, how he has been perceived not just through ancient writing, but through modern TV and modern media as well, because like we said in the beginning, even modern historians today, kind of have this perception of Tiberius as a sexual deviant, as a
Tyrant.
or tyrant, yeah. So let's talk about how he has been perceived throughout history, and how he has been misunderstood as, because like you say in your book, there is no such thing as a good emperor as modern historians kind of view it. So
Yeah, I think Mary Beard.
even so, yeah, it has been. They still he's still kind of, even though there's been no good emperor, he's still an autocrat, but still he has kind of misunderstood as his ruler, and even to this in the 21st century. So let's talk about how his perception in history.
I think it's
Sorry
Mary
for the
Beard.
introduction. Yeah,
I think Mary Beard was the one who actually mentioned about none of them are good or bad, but they're pretty awful, all of them. So a couple of things then, really. You talked about the word propaganda and you mentioned Flavian.
yeah,
So I think that there's a problem with the word propaganda. Propaganda is really, I think, is a 20th century word.
yeah,
And it tends to mean to us, so what we saw in the First World War, the interwar years, and the Second World War with those big posters and, swastikas and stukas and,
yeah.
Russian emblems and American British ones for that matter. I don't know that it's right to think of it quite in those Minister of Propaganda ways, because I don't know that that the Roman authorities were quite as coordinated in that way. There was no, from what I
But even
understand.
were anti-writing, you can clearly see the bias in these
Well,
writings.
right, but what I'm saying is, in a way that the tools that they have, though, if you're an emperor, the tools that you have are the messaging, right? You can
And
communicate
again,
your
for the
victories.
thousandth time this episode, sorry for interrupting you, but you see, even in the Norse mythologies, for example, you see some of the writers there, they have, the leaders, or in the medieval chroniclers, you see that leaders that are bending over the writers, historians' heads, like, you should write this about me. You should,
Yeah.
oh, I was a good person. I did this, say this in the battle, So it's kind of this perception. It kind of was the same in ancient Roman history, wasn't there? Like, you had
To some,
the
it,
emperor writing, being over your head, like, you should write this about said emperor in this other dynasty, for example, Tiberius or other emperors, if you know what I mean.
I do, but I'm going to counter with this. So, for example, I think it's important to remember. So, having said that about propaganda, the second thing I wanted to say was how few of the sources that we know were written have survived. So, one of the things I explain in one of my final concluding chapters in the book is how several historians who would have been contemporary with Tiberius, their works are known by name but are lost completely. The memoir that Tiberius wrote is lost completely by one or two. There's like hints of what we know. So there's the reliance really on a very small number. So there's Velleius Paterculus, who was a contemporary that knew Tiberius. And then after that, we're talking about Tacitus and Suetonius. And then we're talking after that Cassius Dio. And we have some snippets from Plutarch and Seneca and Strabo and so on. And of course, Josephus as well. So I think my job as the historian is to comb through all of that and to identify and see it in its context and why did they write it that way and what does it mean and why does that not agree with this over here and is there something more to it? So the book that I put together, like any other historian, is that exercise, and you try to learn things from that. So to your point about the Flavians, so they came in after Nero. Famous year of the four emperors. So
of course, after the year of the four emperors, as we now call it.
Yeah. So 69. Vespasian, Flavius Vespasianus, replaces the last of the usurpers after Nero. He's been very successful in Judea, where his son Titus is still fighting, and he basically is able to replace the old order with a new family. And Titus Vespasianus, as he is called, brings his family on board with the messaging Judaea Capta. Right, their claim to fame is that they sorted the problems out of the rebellion in Judea, and their whole messaging is based around that. I mean, you'll see coins of a weeping widow beneath a palm tree and a Roman soldier basically standing proudly next to her. It is a break with everything that has gone before. So, in the coins for example, Tiberius, the most common coin of Tiberius is his face on the obverse, and on the reverse is a lady, could be Livia, could be Vesta, could be someone sitting on a very elaborate chair. And there are other coins with those things, but that's mostly what the coins are. And in terms of Augustus, there was a whole load of different types with messages about battles and captives and all sorts of things, gods and goddesses and whatever. But the Flavians came in with a different message. What they effectively were trying, I think, to establish: we're different. You can trust us. We're the good people. The people that came before us were just crazy. And what's very interesting as this Flavian dynasty, which consists of Father Vespasian, son Titus, son Domitian, there's only three of them in this, and they reign from basically 69, 70 through to, I think it's 98. Vespasian rules for something like 10 years, begins the famous work on the Colosseum and other projects like that. It's his son Titus who takes over, who completes and opens the Colosseum, starts to issue coins, copying the coins of the Julio-Claudians in a funny sort of way. In other words, what they're doing now is they're saying, actually, there were some good parts, and in the interest of continuity, we like Augustus, we like Claudius, and oh, by the way, we like Tiberius. So there is a reissued coin under Titus, which actually has literally the face, the profile of Tiberius, with the old inscriptions and a new one on the outside, basically a reissue, a restitution issue of Tiberius. So with the benefit of 20, 30, 40 years of hindsight, people are looking at those times differently. And what's interesting on that, this is where Flavius Josephus is writing about from the point of view of the Judean kings. So Agrippa, for example, Herod before that, and there are lots of little anecdotes and things that he puts in the story about what was going on. That Herod Agrippa was actually associated at different times with Tiberius's court, and at one point apparently relays some kind of message that Tiberius doesn't like and finds himself jailed apparently on the island of Capri. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's in Josephus amongst other things. The interim really seems to give rise to a number of histories which don't survive. Where we get our histories is really towards the tail end of the Flavians, which is people like, for example, Tacitus and Suetonius, who really tip over into Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian. So Hadrian is the man under whom Suetonius really thrives, becomes his public records man, and Tacitus is having his career under people like Nerva and Trajan. So this is another dynasty separated by an even longer period of time. And now we talk about, for example, the empire rising to its greatest extent and how you've got these really good moral men running the Roman Empire, from Nerva being the sort of the senator type, and Trajan being this hero, soldier emperor, and of course Hadrian being the man who goes around securing the frontiers and so on, although he wasn't popular either, by the way. When you add all of those sorts of things up, it puts Tiberius in somewhat of a context. So between Hadrian and Tiberius is what, 10 different emperors, something like that?
Yeah.
Very different stories. And in fact, when the further he recedes into history, his 22 years becomes increasingly less prominent.
He's one of the longest running emperors in Roman history.
If you go from, I think it's AD 14 or 27 BC to about 290 something, he's like the third or fourth, and if you take it right to 470, it's like the seventh.
If you don't count the Eastern Roman Empire, but that's a whole other story.
But I think what's intriguing is the notion that, for example, with Domitian, who was the brother of Titus, the son of Vespasian, he was quite smitten by Tiberius, and apparently one of his favourite books to read was the memoirs of Tiberius, which don't survive, so we've no idea what they tell you, but they would presumably be a fairly straightforward telling of his life. And Domitian found inspiration there. Now, Domitian himself has a reputation which is presently going through somewhat of a rehabilitation, but generally speaking is looked upon as being a cruel, sort of eccentric emperor. I haven't researched enough to know that, in comparison with his brother Titus, who wasn't there long enough to really destroy his reputation, but certainly enjoy. And I'm actually going to be writing a book at some point about him, but that's in the future. So the wheel of history.
Make an episode about that as well, of course.
Yeah, well, I've got to finish the one in Roman Germany first. But the wheel of history turns in such a way that when the man dies, and then the layer cake of people's retrospectives and interpretations, it then becomes problematic, because what becomes objective can now be increasingly subjective. And this is where we start getting the stories of what went on in Capri, for example, that the man's dead. He's not going to be able to come back and defend himself. So, hey, pile it all on, And what you find is that I think in a way, Tiberius is jammed between the ultra heroic sort of Augustus and the very feeble Caligula, and then on to Claudius. And he actually does rule for quite a number of years, 22 years, which is actually longer than the others. But these other things in the story and the narrative that's being built tends to poison him as a character, or there are not such great things happening during his reign. There wasn't a conquering of Egypt. There wasn't a conquest of Britain.
False.
Yeah, but because there wasn't a conquest of Egypt, or there wasn't a conquest of Britain, which makes Augustus famous and which makes Claudius famous. I mean, what did Tiberius do? Well, he quelled a number of rebellions. He kept the peace, and that's not terribly good news. It's not news from the headline point of view. And
he was this heroic emperor that conquered all of it.
It's very telling that, in fact, in the writing of Tacitus, he actually makes this complaint, which I'm paraphrasing. When the emperor basically did a pretty good job of fighting war, something is there's not much glory in this for me to write about. He was complaining that there wasn't really much blood and gore. Yeah. And that would come under Claudius, and that would come under the four emperors, and so on and so forth. So,
if I may, there is a comparison to be made. I don't know if you've seen the House of the Dragons series of that, the spin-off of Game of Thrones. But Viserys the First, under his death, he made the comparison, and I think it is kind of, in a way, I think it's relatable to Tiberius, because Viserys makes the comment that he. Sorry, I have a cold. Do forgive me, but he makes this comparison that Viserys the First, he conquered the land. What did I do? I kept the peace. What will I be remembered for? And I think that kind of relate to Tiberius. He kind of kept the peace. He kept the empire. He kind of saved the empire, if you will, intact.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one in my correspondence, for example, and watching what Tom Holland writes about through his book Dynasty and Pax, he made a comment that Tiberius was the sort of tragic hero of his book Dynasty.
Yeah.
And that resonates with me greatly because I've written about the other people, right? That this is a man some people have said that he was a reluctant emperor. I think that's too strong a word. I think he was very aware of what he was taking on, and he did it with his eyes open, because he could have said no. He was that kind of person. He would have said no, and that's it. I'm done. You wanted to go to Rhodes. Augustus pleaded with him. He went anyway. So if he wanted to decline it, he did. What he wanted to do was on his terms. He wanted to live his life on his terms. He wanted to go and retire on his terms. And they wouldn't let him retire because they said, you're the princeps, you have to keep the head of state role. So he tried to find how could he do this. And the problem is those sorts of personality issues have got lost in the story of him being this tyrant, this deviant living on an island doing a terrible set of things to vulnerable members of our country, which is
Yeah.
guaranteed to cause us to go, oh, and in fact,
and as I say, if I may, as I say in your book, there's no confirming that they didn't have sexual relations on Capri, because there was slavery in ancient Rome.
Yeah.
And slavery did not mean consent, so he could have had
exactly
sexual relations could possibly have had off the books, sexual relations with slaves or
and if you look at if you look at the Warren Cup in the British Museum, it's a silver cup that shows exactly that. If you look at any number of different wall paintings from Roman brothels in Pompeii and other places, that's what's depicted. A slave is an appliance. Sorry to say that, but it's an appliance. Like you'd have a washing machine.
Like you said, Mary Bird talked about this as well in several of the documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
She talked about how slavery wasn't consent, as you think about in American slavery as well. It's not consent. You could have sexual relations with whatever slave you would like.
Yeah.
And you could get away with it.
Yeah. Absolutely, and sometimes the things that were deployed. So all of those things form the greater context in which he and his family lived their lives, and it's very, I think important to know that when you as a modern person read history, is that you have to see them on their terms, in the mores of their times, because of course our mores will have similarities but won't be necessarily the same, and even within our world, right, there are different mores across different cultures and countries. So it's very easy as a sort of Westerner, with a sort of like Enlightenment tradition, to be able to be very judgmental, but then not to understand decisions that people would make in their own times, and then also to see how some decisions like that are being made in our own times too, and the consequences of those when they're not corrected. So I can be as ambiguous as that.
This goes to people and other religion today as well. There is people are judgmental of other religions in the 21st century, for example.
Yeah. But what's interesting to bring the story right up to the 21st century. I mean, where I sort of bring the book to a conclusion, is as an assessment, as if I had him in my office, and I sort of said, "How did you do on the military? How did you do on the family? How did you do on the politics?" And I think he comes out quite well overall. The interesting thing is how history, in my view, slandered his story, and that's the sort of story that the subtext to me. It was the story of a man who secured the Roman Empire, but was slandered by history. And I say that because in the intervening 2,000 years, yes, we had the Flavians doing their things and Josephus doing the things, and then some of the other Roman history. It was fascinating for me two things. One was Julian, the emperor, the apostate, writes a skit about the Caesars for the Saturnalia. I think it's 363 or something like that AD. And the thing that they point to of Tiberius is this old man, who's looking a bit of a state, who's come off his island, and basically that's what he seems to do. He just lives on his island in exile. There's no insinuations necessarily of doing other things at that point in that story. The other thing that was really surprising to me was to study the early Christian historians, the Tertullians, the Eusebiuses, and the orgies.
Tiberius made an appearance I was going to bring this up. Tiberius made an appearance in the Bible, which is he is the Jesus or Josephus, he is executed under Tiberius, but he seemed to be rather favorably portrayed by the Christian chroniclers
Well,
of the
so
time.
Tertullian explains why, and the reason is under Tiberius, Christianity were allowed to flourish. So what's interesting in their telling is that in order for the Christian story to happen, there had to be the crucifixion and the resurrection, but then there
Hmm.
had to be a permissive society in order for those people to proselytize and spread what I think people call these days the good news. So, so the result is you find there's a couple of very interesting things. One, they actually give that sort of positive aspect, and then they blame Pontius Pilate, by the way, for doing the actual crucifixion. But the other aspect of it is really the whole notion that Tiberius was that pro Christianity that when it was proposed that Christ was made into an Olympian god, he supports that motion. And in fact, what in the storytelling, and I don't know if it's true, but it's interesting because it's in the Christian story of the history of the church, is that the Senate pushes back and said, "It is not for you, Caesar, to make those kinds of decisions. It's within the purview of the Senate to be able to decide who becomes God and who's not, and this one doesn't become God." And what Tiberius effectively is able to insist, well, be as that as it may, but these people will not be persecuted for being Christians. Is the story true? I have no idea.
Hmm. Another thing I want to talk about, I swear we're going to end this soon, but I want to talk about Tiberius' portrayal in modern media as well, because on TV and in Netflix and other social novels and etc. So, from your research, what were your perception of Tiberius the man and Tiberius the man portrayed in the media and Netflix, like shows like I Claudius or Barbarians, for example, or other some movies that portray Tiberius. Yeah, he could have had the potential if he had successors, as I say. Yeah, yeah, Mm. Mm. And it, yeah, mm. I think they misrepresented Germanicus, and I will probably make an episode about this. But I feel like Germanicus is one of those misrepresented in the Barbarian TV show. Yeah, sexual diva. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, in the show, the Romans are very much the villains, and the Germans are the heroes of the story. To be fair, Hmm. Yeah, yeah. To do a comparison, he was kind of a Heliogabalus in a way. Put it that way. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think we done round it up there. We've been talking for 3 hours now, which is a record for this podcast, and it certainly doesn't feel like it's been 3 hours. But before you go, of course, where you always have a chat to promote your work. Where do people find your book, Tiberius, from masterly commander to master for emperor of Rome? I mean, even though we spoke for 3 hours, we barely tipped the tip of the iceberg. I mean, look at the book; it's quite thick. So, of course, you should read the book. If you stayed on this long, you should absolutely read the book. So, where do people find the book? And of course, the other episode we done, we done books episode on Agrippa, we done episode on Germanicus, and we done episode on the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So check those out as well. Where are you? Before you go, where are you on social media? Where can people find you if they have further questions about Tiberius or any other episodes that we've done? Where do people find you? Thank you again so much for coming on this podcast. You're always welcome back to this podcast. It's been a great pleasure. You have actually the record of the longest episode on the podcast, and I did not think we would be this long today, to be honest with you. But yes, it's been 3 hours officially by this point, so we have 3 hours exclamation. So it's been great fun. This has been With That Aged Well. We are available on social media and With That Aged Well on Twitter. I refuse to call X still because I'm old school. So it's still Twitter to me. We're Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, under With That Aged Well. That is our social media. You can find us there if you have any questions or have any suggestions on episodes or topics of history that we should do. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. Leave a comment under below if you're on YouTube. What do you think? Do you think about Tiberius? Do you think he's some misunderstood? His sorry, do you think he's a misunderstood emperor slash princeps, or do you think he's just an autocrat tyrant who should deserve his place in history? Or if you're on Spotify, you can leave your comment below as well. Leave us a 5-star review, or if you are an Apple Podcast, you can leave us a 5-star and a review as well. This has been With That Aged Well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining. Take care. Bye.